Imagine a young college girl waiting at a bus stop in Santa Cruz, unaware that one of the most intelligent and terrifying killers in America is watching her. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer, stood nearly 7 feet tall and used his charm and cunning to lure victims like her into his deadly grip. This is not just a story of murder. It's a glimpse into a mind obsessed with control, manipulation, and ritual. As we follow Kemper's horrifying but calculated crimes, you'll see how he selected his victims, planned every move, and executed his acts with chilling precision. Close your eyes, focus on the images of Kemper, and step inside the mind of a serial killer whose terror haunted an entire city. What you're about to see is the horrifying reality behind one of California's most infamous crimes. If you'd like more stories like this to appear on your page, please like, comment where you are watching from, and subscribe. There are 15 chapters in this series, each with one picture looping gently. Just close your eyes, relax, and let's dive into the story together. Chapter 1: Shadows of Childhood. The Making of a Giant. From the very beginning, Edmund Emil Kemper's life seemed to be marked by contradictions, shadows, and unsettling currents that ran beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary existence. Born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, Edmund was the middle child of Clarnell and Edmund Kemper II. His very entrance into the world came at a time of turbulence for his family. His father, a World War II veteran, returned from the Pacific Theater not to peace, but to a household that quickly became fraught with discord. His mother, Clarnell, a sharp-tongued woman known for her harsh and often cruel words, would come to shape much of the psychological storm that brewed inside the boy who would one day be remembered as one of California's most chilling killers. Edmund was a child who seemed out of proportion to the world around him. By the time most children were learning to blend into the rhythm of childhood games, Edmund was already marked by his unusual size. He would grow to be 6 feet, 9 inches tall in adulthood, a towering presence. But even as a boy, he seemed physically out of sync with those around him. His unusual height and the sense of being different only deepened his feelings of isolation. The boy felt out of place in a world that did not seem to know what to do with him, and the people closest to him offered little in the way of comfort. His parents' marriage was a battlefield. His father, worn down by Clarnell's endless criticisms, withdrew more and more, while his mother directed her bitterness at Edmund himself. She saw in him traits she despised, claiming he reminded her of his father, and perhaps out of spite, she placed the weight of her resentment upon the child. She would belittle him, mock him, and deny him affection. To grow up under such conditions meant Edmund was constantly seeking warmth and love, but finding only rejection and scorn. This cycle of need and denial planted a seed of rage deep within him, a rage that would fester for years before erupting in violence. Even in childhood, disturbing behaviors began to manifest. Fascinated by death, young Edmund would engage in games that unsettled those who caught glimpses of them. He buried the family cat alive once, later digging it up to see what had happened. On another occasion, he killed a cat outright, hiding its body until discovery forced him to admit his actions. To outsiders, these were perhaps the cruel games of a troubled boy, but in reality, they were early markers of the darkness taking root inside him. These moments reveal a fascination with control over life and death, a theme that would come to dominate his later years. By the age of 10, Edmund's fantasies were already shifting into places that revealed his dangerous mindset. He would daydream about power, about being in control of those around him, and sometimes about acts of violence. His isolation at school, coupled with the ridicule he experienced both inside and outside the home, fed these thoughts. He was taller and larger than most of his peers, but inside, he was deeply insecure. He often felt invisible, or worse, unwanted. The cruelty of his mother's words reinforced those feelings, as she often told him that no woman would ever love him, and that he was destined to be alone as the years passed. The divide between Edmund and the normal rhythms of teenage life grew wider. He did not simply feel misunderstood, he felt alien. By age 14, the tension in the Kemper household had reached unbearable levels. His parents divorced, and Clarnell took the children to Montana, leaving Edmund's father behind in California. For Edmund, this meant an intensification of his isolation, trapped under the critical gaze of a mother who never let him forget her disdain. It was in Montana that his fantasies grew darker and his sense of alienation deepened further. The young boy, now a teenager, began to withdraw even more into his imagination. He constructed elaborate scenarios in his mind, some of which revolved around capturing and controlling people, often women, who became central figures in his private world. At the same time, he began to exhibit signs of intelligence that baffled those around him. Despite his disturbing tendencies, Edmund was articulate, thoughtful, and capable of profound insight. His IQ would later be measured at around 145, placing him in the gifted range. Yet this intelligence, instead of offering him a path toward stability, seemed only to feed his ability to plan and rationalize his fantasies that in many ways, Edmund's size, intelligence, and unsettling behaviors created a perfect storm. He was a boy who outwardly looked imposing, but inwardly was a cauldron of fear, rejection, and resentment. His mother's rejection cut the deepest. Clarnell often forced him to sleep in the basement, as if to isolate him further from the rest of the family. She justified this by saying she feared he might harm his sisters, but for Edmund, it felt like exile. The dark basement became a place of fear and humiliation, and yet also a place where his mind roamed unchecked. In that isolation, his fantasies began to crystallize into something more tangible, edging closer to the actions he would later take. Looking back on these early years, one can see the outline of the man he would become. A childhood marked by neglect, ridicule, and psychological abuse had forged a young man who carried immense anger beneath a quiet surface. The early killings of animals showed his need for dominance and foreshadowed the horrors yet to come. His fantasies revealed a growing detachment from the boundaries of morality. In the environment in which he grew up, dominated by a cruel mother and absent father, ensured that his inner darkness would be fed rather than starved. The making of Edmund Kemper was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual descent. Each slight, each rejection, each cruel word from his mother, and each lonely night in that basement added another layer to the complex and dangerous individual he was becoming. He was not simply growing up. He was evolving into something that would one day shock the world, a man whose size, intelligence, and deep-seated rage would combine into a figure of both fascination and horror. In those shadows of childhood, the blueprint of the co-ed killer was being drawn, line by line, experience by experience, until it was ready to emerge into the world in a way no one could have foreseen. As Edmund Kemper grew into adolescence, the fractures of his childhood only widened, and his world became more estranged from the experiences of other teenagers. By the age of 15, his towering height made him appear older than his years, and yet inside, he remained an insecure boy trapped in a war against his own loneliness. The basement isolation had shaped him into a silent observer of life rather than a participant. He often listened to the muffled sounds of his mother and sisters upstairs, the laughter and conversations that excluded him, and the resentment boiled deeper with every night spent underground. During these years, Edmund began to practice behaviors that hinted at his desire for control and power. He would sneak out at night with a small pocket knife, not to hurt anyone at first, but to imagine what it might feel like to have authority over another human being. He became obsessed with the idea of power, the kind he lacked within his family, but could fabricate in his fantasies. He spoke little of this inner world to anyone, for he knew instinctively that his thoughts were not like those of the other boys his age. But in silence, he cultivated them, letting them grow unchecked. School offered little reprieve. Despite his high intelligence, Edmund did not thrive socially. His peers viewed him as strange, and his size only set him apart further. Teachers noticed he was articulate, but sometimes distracted, lost in daydreams. Some classmates remembered him as quiet, even polite, but there was a distance in him, as if he were not truly part of the same reality they all shared. His attempts to connect with girls often ended in embarrassment, as he was shy and awkward, and his mother's constant ridicule about how no woman would ever want him echoed in his mind. It was as if every rejection confirmed her cruel predictions. By the mid-1960s, Edmund's relationship with his mother had reached a breaking point. She accused him of being dangerous, of harboring violent tendencies, and often voiced her fear of him. Ironically, her words seemed to push him closer to fulfilling the very role she cast upon him. She claimed she worried for the safety of his sisters, and eventually, she insisted that Edmund move to live with his father in California. But when Edmund arrived, he discovered his father had remarried and had little interest in caring for his difficult teenage son. The rejection struck deeply, another reminder that he belonged nowhere. Within months, his father sent him to live with his paternal grandparents in rural North Fork, California. Life with his grandparents was meant to be a solution, but instead it became the stage for the first eruption of violence. His grandmother, Maud, was strict and domineering, reminding him in many ways of his mother. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was elderly and kind, but distant, offering little warmth or connection. The isolation of the farm, combined with his grandmother's controlling nature, created an environment where Edmund's fantasies began to spill into reality. He started carrying firearms around the property, ostensibly for hunting, but in truth, he often used them to practice aiming at imagined targets. His grandmother complained about his behavior, forbidding him from carrying his guns around, which only intensified his feelings of resentment. In August 1964, when Edmund was just 15, the tension reached its fatal climax. One summer day, in a sudden act of violence, he shot his grandmother while she sat at the kitchen table writing a letter. The act was not impulsive alone. It carried with it years of pent-up rage against women who belittled and controlled him. In his mind, it was both an act of rebellion and release. Moments later, when his grandfather returned home, Edmund shot him as well. He later explained that he didn't want his grandfather to suffer the grief of discovering his wife dead. It was a chillingly calculated decision for a teenager, showcasing the cold logic that would later define his crimes. After the killings, Edmund seemed almost relieved. He calmly called his mother, confessing to what he had done, and she instructed him to call the police. When officers arrived, they found a tall, quiet boy who had just committed 2 murders but spoke of them with a chilling matter-of-factness. He was arrested without resistance, and the enormity of his actions began to unfold before authorities who struggled to comprehend how a 15-year-old could commit such acts with such calm detachment. Psychologists were called in to evaluate him, and what they found was both disturbing and complex. Edmund was highly intelligent, articulate, and capable of deep introspection. Yet beneath the surface was a youth seething with rage. unable to form healthy relationships, and increasingly detached from normal human empathy. His fascination with control, violence, and death alarmed those who studied him, and his early acts of cruelty toward animals now seemed like early warnings that had gone unnoticed. The courts decided Edmund was mentally ill and sent him to Atascadero State Hospital, a secure psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. It was here that Edmund's adolescence unfolded in a most unusual environment, not among peers at school, but among hardened offenders and under the eyes of psychiatrists. He was a boy in body, but often seen as a man due to his size and demeanor, and in this institution, his intelligence flourished in ways that both impressed and frightened his evaluators. He absorbed psychological knowledge, studied the behaviors of others, and learned how to speak in ways that could convince people of his stability. The murders of his grandparents marked the end of his childhood in a definitive and horrifying way. No longer just a troubled boy, Edmund had stepped into a reality shaped by blood, violence, and consequences. The shadows of his childhood had grown darker, and though the world believed he was now contained, the seeds of what would later become his reign of terror in California were only beginning to take root. In those years before he became known as the co-ed killer, Edmund Kemper was already a figure of contradiction, a boy who was intelligent yet disturbed, polite yet capable of shocking violence, lonely yet filled with fantasies of domination. The story of his childhood, ending with the deaths of his grandparents, reads less like the tale of a troubled youth and more like the prologue to a nightmare that would one day stretch across the highways and college campuses of California. His descent was not complete, but the first chapter of his life had already carved out the contours of the darkness to come, leaving psychologists, police, and society itself grappling with how such a young man could carry such violence within him. Chapter 2: Broken Homes and Early Wounds. The co-ed killer of California. The home is often seen as the first world a child inhabits, the place where love and guidance should form the bedrock of one's future. For Edmund Kemper, however, that world was fractured from the start, and the cracks in its foundation ran deep. The son of Clarnell Strandberg and Edmund Kemper, too, he was born into a household where conflict seemed to breathe through the walls. His father, once a decorated U.S. Army veteran who had witnessed the destructive power of nuclear weapons as part of his military service, returned from war only to find a battlefield of a different kind inside his own home. The marriage between Clarnell and Edmund Sr. was marked by resentment, criticism, and relentless discord. Clarnell was a woman who possessed a sharp intellect and a dominating personality, but also an unrelenting bitterness that seemed to saturate her every interaction. She frequently belittled her husband, telling him he was worthless, mocking his career, and accusing him of failing as both a man and a father. For young Edmund, this constant barrage of hostility created an environment of insecurity and tension. His father withdrew more and more, retreating into silence, while Clarnell's voice only grew louder and sharper, filling the household with her dissatisfaction. For a boy growing up in this climate, affection was scarce. Edmund watched as his parents' marriage crumbled, and he absorbed not warmth, but lessons in bitterness, rejection, and alienation. Clarnell often turned her rage toward him, treating her son not with tenderness but with disdain. She told him repeatedly that he was awkward, that no woman would ever want to be with him, and that he was destined to live alone. To hear such things from a mother, the person a child most longs to please and be comforted by, was devastating. Edmund's hunger for love was answered instead with ridicule, a wound that grew larger with each passing year. When the marriage finally ended, the split only worsened matters. Edmund Sr. left, retreating into a new life far away, and Clarnell took her children to Helena, Montana. The divorce meant that young Edmund lost not only the possibility of his father's protection, but also any semblance of balance in his life. Under Clarnell's sole influence, the household became a place of constant criticism. She forced Edmund to sleep in the basement, away from his sisters, claiming she feared he might hurt them. In truth, her actions seemed designed to exile him, to remind him daily that he was unwanted. The basement was cold, dark, and lonely, and as he lay there listening to the muffled sounds of life above, the seeds of resentment and alienation pushed deeper into his psyche. It is here that Edmund's private world began to take shape. Cut off from affection and companionship, he retreated into his imagination, but his fantasies were not innocent daydreams of adventure or success. Instead, they began to twist around themes of power and domination, reflections of the helplessness he felt in his real life. He fantasized about controlling others, about exacting revenge against those who hurt him, and sometimes about violence itself. He was a boy without a place, building a world inside his mind that would one day spill outward with devastating force. At school, the picture was no brighter. His unusual height, towering over classmates even as a young teenager, made him stand out in ways that only fueled his awkwardness. He was intelligent, with an IQ later measured at 145, but his brilliance did not shield him from loneliness. Teachers noticed his potential, but peers often saw only a strange, oversized boy who seemed disconnected from the easy flow of friendships and social life. He was quiet, sometimes polite, but distant. Attempts at connection often ended in rejection, further validating his mother's cruel prediction that he would always be unwanted. During this time, Edmund began to display troubling behaviors that hinted at the violence simmering beneath his quiet exterior. His fascination with death became apparent in childhood, when he killed the family cat, not once but twice, first by burying one alive, later by killing another with a knife. These were not random acts of cruelty, but experiments in control, moments where he could decide the fate of a living creature in ways he could never control his own life. Psychologists would later look back on these incidents as critical warning signs, markers of the trajectory he was already on. But at the time, they were brushed aside as the strange, disturbing habits of a troubled boy. Meanwhile, his relationship with his father deteriorated into nothingness. After the divorce, Edmund longed for contact, but his father had remarried and was building a new family. When Edmund was sent to live briefly with his father, he found himself unwelcome, an intruder in a household that had no place for him. Once again, rejection cut deep. His father eventually sent him away to live with his grandparents, Maud and Edmund Sr., on a small farm in North Fork, California. This was intended as a solution, a chance for Edmund to be in a stable environment, but instead it placed him in yet another household where he felt stifled and unwanted. With his grandmother, the echoes of his mother returned. Maud was domineering, quick to correct him, and unafraid to impose her will. She monitored his use of firearms and attempted to control his behavior, often humiliating him with sharp criticisms. To Edmund, she became another embodiment of the maternal rejection he had endured all his life. His grandfather was kinder but elderly and distant, unable to offer the connection Edmund so desperately needed. The farm became not a refuge, but another prison of isolation and frustration. By now, his inner world had begun to overlap with his outer one in dangerous ways. He carried firearms around the property, claiming he was hunting, but in truth, he was rehearsing control, aiming at invisible enemies in his mind. His grandmother's authority over him only fed his anger, and the silence of the rural landscape became the backdrop for a storm that was gathering inside him. It is difficult to imagine the weight carried by a boy like Edmund Kemper during these years. A boy who stood taller than everyone around him, but felt perpetually small in the eyes of those he loved. A boy whose intelligence allowed him to understand his pain, but offered no cure. A boy who craved love and connection, but found only rejection and exile. These broken homes and early wounds did not merely shape his childhood. They sculpted the architecture of his inner world, a place where fantasies of domination and death began to replace the possibility of ordinary human happiness. And though the world did not yet know it, these wounds were laying the groundwork for a future in which those private fantasies would turn into public horror. The echoes of rejection seemed to follow Edmund Kemper wherever he went, as if fate itself had conspired to deny him belonging. His mother's house had been a crucible of cruelty, his father's home an empty promise of family, and his grandparents' farm yet another cage. Each environment, instead of soothing his turmoil, deepened it. And yet, the outside world saw only fragments. A boy too big for his age, quiet, perhaps awkward, but nothing that suggested the storm gathering within. By the time Edmund turned 15, his psychological state was a labyrinth of fear, longing, and anger. His fantasies of control had become more detailed, often revolving around women. To him, women were both objects of desire and sources of humiliation. He longed for affection but also associated it with rejection and pain, thanks to his mother's relentless words. When Clarnell told him no girl would ever love him, it was not merely a cruel remark. It was a prophecy that shaped his view of relationships. He began to imagine scenarios where he could seize control, where rejection was impossible because he held all the power. The psychological isolation of being forced to sleep in a basement, cut off from his sisters, was not just a physical exile, but an emotional one. Alone in the dark, Edmund conjured imaginary worlds where he wasn't the awkward, unwanted boy but someone feared, respected, even obeyed. These were not fleeting daydreams. They were rehearsals for dominance, a reversal of the helplessness that defined his daily life. It is telling that when he later described these early years, he recalled them with bitterness but also with a chilling clarity, as though the darkness of the basement had etched those thoughts into his identity forever. As his adolescence progressed, Edmund's behaviors revealed flashes of the man he would become. His cruelty toward animals was not impulsive but deliberate. He buried the family cat alive, later retrieving the body as though conducting an experiment. He killed another cat and dismembered it, hiding the pieces until discovery forced his confession. Such acts were rehearsals in violence, tests of control, and reflections of the disconnection he already felt from normal boundaries of empathy. Neighbors and family members noticed oddities, but chalked them up to the troubles of a difficult boy. No one imagined these acts were stepping stones to far greater horrors. The tension with his grandmother intensified over time. Living in North Fork, Edmund's days were filled with monotony, and his grandmother's sharp criticisms grated on him. She reminded him constantly of his inadequacies, often mocking him in ways that felt eerily similar to his mother's ridicule. She restricted his use of firearms, ordered him about, and diminished his sense of autonomy. For a teenager already consumed with fantasies of power, this was gasoline poured on a simmering fire. His grandfather, though gentler, was old and frail, unable to bridge the gap or offer the stability Edmund so desperately needed. It is no surprise then that the violence within him sought release. On a summer day in August 1964, that release came suddenly and irrevocably. Edmund shot his grandmother in the head while she sat at the kitchen table, absorbed in her writing. He later claimed he killed her to see what it felt like. In his words, it was not an accident, not even rage in the moment, but a conscious decision to enact what had lived in his fantasies for years. When his grandfather returned from buying groceries, Edmund shot him as well, explaining later that he did not want the old man to suffer the grief of discovering his wife dead. It was a decision steeped in cold logic, especially chilling coming from a boy who was barely 15 that after the killings, Edmund did not flee into panic or denial. Instead, he calmly called his mother to confess, as if seeking the very recognition she had always denied him. Her reaction was one of shock, but she instructed him to contact the police. When officers arrived, they found a towering teenager, calm and cooperative, as if murder had brought him not chaos but clarity. He confessed with a matter-of-fact tone that unsettled investigators, revealing an ability to detach himself from the horror of his actions. The murders of his grandparents shocked the community and confounded authorities. How could a 15-year-old boy commit such acts with such composure? Psychiatrists were brought in, and what they uncovered painted a picture both fascinating and disturbing. Edmund was not only deeply troubled, but also highly intelligent. His IQ was measured at around 145, placing him well above average. He was articulate, capable of expressing his thoughts clearly, and seemed almost eager to discuss his inner world. Yet beneath this intelligence lay a profound inability to connect emotionally with others, particularly women, and a fascination with death and control that unsettled even seasoned professionals. The courts decided Edmund was not to be treated as a typical criminal, but as a patient. He was committed to Atascadero State Hospital, a maximum security psychiatric facility for the criminally insane. Here, among adults who had committed acts of violence and sexual crimes, Edmund spent his formative teenage years. For most, such a place would have been terrifying, but for Edmund, it became a perverse kind of classroom. He absorbed psychological theories, studied criminal behavior, and learned how to manipulate conversations with doctors and fellow patients. He memorized psychiatric vocabulary and began to craft an image of himself as someone who was learning, improving, and rehabilitating. Yet beneath this outward performance, the darkness remained. He listened to the confessions of sex offenders, absorbing their stories, their methods, and their obsessions. He began to understand the mechanisms of manipulation, the patterns of behavior, and how to mimic normality convincingly. What the staff saw as progress was, in truth, Edmund refining his ability to conceal his inner world. He learned what words psychiatrists wanted to hear, what behaviors would earn him praise, and how to present himself as someone who had been cured. In reality, Atascadero did not extinguish his violent fantasies. It taught him how to hide them better. The broken homes of his youth had shaped him into a boy desperate for control. The early wounds inflicted by a cruel mother, an absent father, and a dismissive grandmother had carved deep scars that no institution could erase. If anything, they made him more dangerous. For while society believed it had contained him, Edmund was learning how to play the role of the rehabilitated patient, preparing for the day he would be released back into a world that had no idea what was waiting for it. The story of these early wounds is not just a tale of personal suffering, but a blueprint of the co-ed killer's making. In the quiet loneliness of basements, in the sting of maternal rejection, in the empty spaces left by absent fathers, and in the cold lessons of psychiatric wards, Edmund Kemper's identity was being forged. And when he emerged, he would not be the awkward, insecure boy who entered those institutions, but a man who knew how to cloak his darkness in charm, intelligence, and composure, until the moment he decided to unleash it. Chapter 3. The First Murders, Grandparents in Silence. The summer of 1964 in rural North Fork, California, seemed quiet, ordinary even, with its dry roads, scattered farms, and the slow rhythm of life far removed from the bustle of cities. But in the Kemper household, hidden away on a modest property, a teenage boy carried with him a storm that had been building for years. Edmund Kemper, already towering above most adults at 15, walked the halls of his grandparents' home with a weight pressing down on his mind, a weight made up of rejection, ridicule, and unfulfilled longing. To the outside world, he was a boy struggling with the challenges of adolescence. To himself, he was a prisoner, trapped once again under the scrutiny of a domineering woman and the absence of true affection. His grandmother, Maud, was no cruel stranger to the idea of discipline. A sharp and controlling figure, she believed in order and rules, and she wielded her authority over Edmund with a firm hand. She monitored his behavior, criticized his actions, and forbade him from carrying firearms on the property when she saw he grew too obsessed with them. To Edmund, her control felt suffocating, echoing the voice of his mother who had belittled him for years. The young man who had been forced to sleep in dark basements and endure endless lectures about his worthlessness now found himself in another home where his very existence seemed under constant surveillance. For Edmund, his grandmother was not simply a relative. She became a symbol of all the women who had mocked, rejected, or controlled him. The sting of his mother's words, "No woman will ever want you," seemed to live in Maud's corrections and dismissals. Every time she told him what he could or could not do, every time she imposed her authority, it deepened the resentment that churned inside him. To the outside eye, these were ordinary family squabbles. To Edmund, they were sparks to the fire that had been smoldering since childhood. His grandfather, Edmund Sr., was a different presence altogether. A kind but frail man, he was far less confrontational than his wife. Yet his distance offered little relief. He was elderly, often distracted with errands or simple tasks, and he provided no buffer between his wife's strictness and his grandson's resentment. To young Edmund, his grandfather was more of a background figure than a guiding force. The teenager longed for understanding and affection, but he received instead a hollow silence that was within this dynamic, a blend of suffocation and neglect that Edmund's fantasies of power began to harden into something tangible. For years, he had rehearsed control in his mind, first through cruel acts against animals, then through elaborate daydreams. But now, in the oppressive quiet of the farm, those fantasies edged closer to reality. He carried his firearms with him, defying his grandmother's rules when he could, stalking the property as though preparing for something more than a hunt. He had begun to wonder not only about killing, but about what it would feel like to kill a human being. On August 27, 1964, the line between thought and action disappeared. That morning began like any other. His grandmother sat at the kitchen table, writing a letter, her pen scratching across the paper, her back straight as always, her demeanor sharp. Edmund entered the room with a rifle, the weight of his fantasies pressing against the moment. In later confessions, he would say he killed her to see what it felt like. The simplicity of his explanation was as chilling as the act itself. He raised the weapon and shot her in the head. The sound shattered the stillness of the farmhouse, a violent echo of years of silence and resentment exploding in a single instant. But Edmund was not finished. He fired again, shooting her multiple times in the head and back, ensuring she was dead. There was no panic in his movements, no collapse into confusion. Instead, there was a strange sense of calm, as though the act had given form to the storm that had been growing inside him for so long. His grandmother, the woman who had controlled him, mocked him, and symbolized his deepest wounds, lay lifeless at the table. Moments later, his grandfather returned from buying groceries. The old man, unaware of the horror waiting inside, stepped toward the house. Edmund, standing there with the rifle still warm in his hands, made another calculated decision. He shot his grandfather dead before the man could even understand what had happened. Later, Edmund explained that he killed him not out of rage, but out of pity, that he did not want his grandfather to face the grief of finding his wife murdered. It was a twisted reasoning, one that revealed both his cold calculation and his disturbing sense of control over life and death. In those few minutes, Edmund Kemper crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. He had gone from violent fantasies and small experiments with cruelty to the reality of murder. And not just murder, but the murder of those closest to him. The boy who had once been mocked for his awkwardness was now a killer, his quiet exterior shattered by the sound of gunfire that ended 2 lives in silence. What is perhaps most unsettling is not only the act itself, but the way Edmund responded afterward. There was no frantic attempt to hide the bodies, no flight into the woods, no frantic cover-up. Instead, he picked up the phone and called his mother. Calmly, he confessed to what he had done, as if he were finally speaking out loud the words he had been rehearsing in his mind for years. His mother, stunned, told him to call the police. And he did. When authorities arrived, they encountered a tall, composed teenager who offered no resistance. He told them plainly that he had killed his grandparents. There was no wild denial, no attempt at excuses. His demeanor unnerved the officers, for it was as if he were describing something mundane rather than something monstrous. In his words, in his tone, there was a chilling detachment that suggested he had already processed the act in his mind long before carrying it out. For investigators, the question was immediate and overwhelming. How could a boy so young commit such an act with such calm resolve? For Edmund, the answer was simple. He had long lived in a world where rejection was constant, and in that moment, he had found a way to seize control. His grandmother had symbolized every wound inflicted by the women in his life, and his grandfather's death was, to him, a mercy killing. To the outside world, it was unthinkable. To Edmund, it was almost inevitable. When Edmund Kemper was taken into custody for the murder of his grandparents, the authorities were confronted with a case that challenged every expectation they had of crime, punishment, and psychology. Here was a 15-year-old boy, unusually tall, unusually articulate, confessing without hesitation to killing the 2 people who had taken him in. It was not the picture of a hardened criminal fleeing justice, nor the image of a confused child lost in panic. Instead, it was something far more unnerving, a young man who seemed to understand exactly what he had done, yet spoke of it with a strange detachment, as though the killings were both inevitable and oddly logical. The police, stunned by the brutality and the boy's calmness, quickly realized that this was not a case that could be handled as an ordinary juvenile offense. Most teenage crimes involved fights, thefts, or reckless acts that spiraled out of control. But Edmund's crime was premeditated in its essence, if not in its immediate timing. He admitted that he had fantasized about killing for years, and when asked about his motives, his answers were chillingly simple. He told investigators that he had wanted to know what it felt like to kill. He admitted resentment toward his grandmother, claiming she always picked on him and argued too much. And his grandfather, he explained, was shot so that the old man would not have to suffer the shock of discovering his wife's body. Such reasoning revealed both cruelty and calculation, but it also revealed a boy who was already detached from conventional human emotion. At 15, Edmund could discuss murder as though it were a philosophical experiment, something carried out to satisfy curiosity rather than a moral transgression. That detachment disturbed psychologists, who were immediately brought in to assess him. They wanted to know whether he was simply a dangerous youth lashing out, or whether there was something far darker buried within him. The results of those early evaluations were unsettling. Psychiatrists described Edmund as highly intelligent, with an IQ measured at 136, well above average. He was articulate, polite, and even charming in interviews, qualities that seemed at odds with the brutality of his crime. Yet beneath the surface, they also found deep resentment, fantasies of violence, and an inability to connect with others in a healthy way. He admitted to daydreams about killing women, about domination and control, even though at that age he had never had a normal romantic relationship. His inner world was already populated with themes of power, death, and rejection that TO the courts. However, the central fact remained. Edmund was still a juvenile. He was too young for the adult penal system, and despite the shock of his crimes, society was not prepared to treat a 15-year-old as an irredeemable killer. The decision was made to commit him to the Atascadero State Hospital, a facility designed for the criminally insane, where doctors would evaluate and treat him. The hope, however faint, was that a boy so young might still be reformed under careful supervision. Atascadero was no ordinary institution. It was a secure psychiatric hospital that housed some of California's most dangerous offenders, men who had committed murders, assaults, and other violent crimes. For Edmund, it became both a prison and a classroom. Within its walls, he was not simply treated. He was observed, studied, and, in many ways, educated about the very psychology of crime. He became a model patient, cooperative with staff, eager to participate in programs, and willing to share his thoughts. He quickly absorbed the language of psychology, learning the terminology of mental illness, manipulation, and behavior. To the doctors, he seemed to be progressing. To Edmund, it was an opportunity to understand how others thought, and more importantly, how he could conceal his own darkness. During his years at Atascadero, Edmund was given tasks that allowed him to interact with staff and other patients. He even worked in the hospital's psychiatric testing unit, where he administered psychological assessments to other inmates. For a boy who had once felt powerless, this was a revelation. He learned how to ask questions, how to read people, and how to present himself in ways that earned trust. He studied the very methods by which doctors detected mental illness, and in doing so, he became skilled at hiding his own impulses. When the time came for reevaluation, Edmund impressed his doctors. He spoke openly about his crime, expressing remorse that seemed genuine. He claimed that he had grown, that he had reflected on his actions, and that he no longer harbored violent fantasies. The doctors, moved by his intelligence and apparent sincerity, began to believe that he might be rehabilitated. By the time he reached the age of 21, they recommended his release. It was a decision that would later haunt them. In their reports, they described him as reformed, no longer a danger to society. They recommended that his juvenile record be sealed, so that his crimes would not follow him into adulthood. The boy who had murdered his grandparents was about to step back into the world as a free young man, his past effectively hidden, but beneath his calm exterior, Edmund had not truly changed. He had learned, instead, how to say the right words, how to present the right image, and how to convince others that he was safe. His fantasies had not disappeared. They had simply gone underground, growing darker, more elaborate, and more dangerous with time. He would later admit that while he told doctors what they wanted to hear, his mind was still consumed by visions of domination, violence, and control. The release of Edmund Kemper from Atascadero marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, far more terrifying one. The murders of his grandparents had been his first step across the line, a test of what it felt like to kill. His years in the hospital had taught him not how to suppress those urges, but how to disguise them, how to mask his intentions, and how to prepare for the future he would carve with chilling precision. When he walked out of the hospital gates, taller and more articulate than ever, the world saw a young man given a second chance. What they did not see was that inside, the co-ed killer was waiting, ready to begin the dark path that would make him one of the most infamous names in American crime history. Chapter 4: Release and the Return to a World of Women. In 1969, after nearly 5 years inside the walls of Atascadero State Hospital, Edmund Kemper walked free. He was no longer the awkward teenager who had entered those halls at 15. Now 21, he was a towering figure of 6 feet 9 inches, his frame casting shadows that made him appear even older. His voice had deepened, his manner had grown polished, and his ability to navigate conversations carried a kind of quiet charm that few would have expected from someone with his past. On paper, he was the very model of rehabilitation, intelligent, articulate, and compliant. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, there remained the same dark hunger that had first driven him to kill. The doctors who released him believed they had witnessed a success story. In their notes, they described Edmund as a young man who had learned from his mistakes, who had shown remorse, and who seemed ready to build a normal life. His violent outburst at 15 was framed as a tragic anomaly, the result of youthful immaturity rather than ingrained pathology. They recommended his record be sealed, a decision meant to give him a fresh start. But what this meant in practice was chilling. His history of double murder would not appear on future background checks, and those who encountered him in the years to come would see only a polite, intelligent young man with a clean slate. But as Edmund re-entered society, he faced a question that no psychological test could predict. How would he function in a world that had never truly accepted him? The patterns that had shaped his childhood had not vanished. His mother, Clarnell, was still alive, and the bitter relationship between them quickly reignited. Despite his protests, he was sent to live with her in Santa Cruz, California, a decision made by parole authorities who believed reuniting him with family would provide stability. In truth, it was like pouring fuel back onto a smoldering fire. Clarnell's apartment in the university town was a small, cramped space, and in it, Edmund once again found himself under the rule of a domineering woman. Clarnell was sharp-tongued, critical, and quick to belittle him. She mocked his size, telling him that no woman would ever want to be with a giant like him. She questioned his intelligence, dismissed his ambitions, and ridiculed his awkwardness around women. For Edmund, who had spent years trying to suppress his rage in Atascadero, it was like being thrust back into the very conditions that had fueled his earliest violence to the outside world. He tried to play the role of a normal young man. He found work with the California Division of Highways, where his size and strength made him a natural fit for laborious tasks. He earned money, made casual acquaintances, and appeared to be building a quiet, stable life. But in the shadows of his thoughts, the fantasies that had haunted him as a teenager continued to grow. Living near the university, he was surrounded daily by young women. College students walking to class, hitchhikers standing at intersections, girls laughing with their friends in the sunlit streets of Santa Cruz. To Edmund, these women were both objects of longing and symbols of rejection. They represented the love and acceptance he had always craved. Yet they also embodied the fear and humiliation he had endured when ridiculed by his mother and ignored by girls his age. He began to fixate on them. At first, it was harmless enough in appearance, driving past groups of students, observing them from a distance, imagining what it would be like to speak with them, to connect. But his mind did not linger on connection for long. Instead, it drifted back to the fantasies he had nurtured in adolescence, fantasies of control, of absolute power over another person. He wondered what it would be like to pick up one of these young women and take her somewhere no one could intervene at a tea night. When the apartment grew quiet and his mother's voice finally fell silent, Edmund would lie awake, replaying scenarios in his head. He envisioned encounters where he was no longer the awkward, rejected boy but the figure in control. These thoughts, unspoken and hidden, gave him a secret sense of relief, even as they deepened the grooves of obsession. And each day, walking the streets of Santa Cruz, the presence of college women made those obsessions harder to ignore. It was during this time that Edmund began to rehearse the logistics of abduction. He paid close attention to how hitchhikers traveled, noticing which roads they used and how often they were picked up by strangers. The late 1960s and early 1970s were years when hitchhiking was common, a symbol of youthful freedom and trust in a world that seemed less threatening than it truly was. For Edmund, it was an opportunity presented daily on the roads he drove. He began to imagine himself pulling over, offering a ride, and then diverting from the expected path. He experimented, picking up young women and driving them to their destinations, all while concealing his true intentions. Each successful ride where nothing happened served a dual purpose. It allowed him to build confidence that he could appear harmless, and it also fed his private fantasies about what he might do if he chose not to let them go. The women he picked up never suspected that the man behind the wheel had once killed his grandparents, nor that he was silently imagining scenarios that ended with violence. Yet despite his growing urges, Edmund also carried a peculiar hesitation. He knew the enormity of murder, and he knew the risk of being caught. He had experienced the consequences once before, though shielded by youth, and part of him wondered if he could suppress his darker desires. For a time, this hesitation acted as a fragile barrier, keeping him from action. But the constant tension with his mother, the sting of rejection, and the endless presence of potential victims began to erode that barrier. The stage was being set for something far larger than the tragedy at his grandparents' home. Edmund was no longer a boy curious about the act of killing. He was a man whose fantasies had been sharpened by years of isolation and who now had access to a world filled with exactly the type of victims his mind had long conjured. He was living in a town filled with young women who trusted the kindness of strangers, who stepped into cars without fear, and who believed the roads of California were safe. To them, Edmund was just another driver. To himself, he was rehearsing for the day when his fantasies would finally break free. Living once again under his mother's roof, Edmund Kemper experienced a cruel paradox. To the parole board and the doctors who had recommended his release, he was the model of rehabilitation. To neighbors and co-workers, he was polite, soft-spoken, and unassuming despite his great size. Yet behind the closed doors of Clarnell's small apartment, his life fell into an old and familiar cycle of tension, belittlement, and rage. Clarnell treated her son less like a man returning from rehabilitation and more like the awkward, unwanted child she had always seen him as. She criticized his mannerisms, mocked his inability to date, and told him that women his age would laugh at the idea of being with someone like him. She called him a failure, a burden, and even compared him unfavorably to his sisters. To Edmund, these remarks cut deeper than most words could. After years in a psychiatric facility where doctors told him he had potential and intelligence, returning home to his mother's scorn was like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. The environment became a crucible of frustration. On the outside, Edmund presented himself as a responsible young man. He held down his job with the California Division of Highways, earning a respectable income. He saved money, socialized lightly with coworkers, and even earned their sympathy when he complained about his domineering mother. Yet the rage inside him was building, fueled by daily encounters with her sharp tongue. It was not only what she said, but the tone, the sense of superiority, the way she made him feel like a child trapped in a man's body. The irony of his situation was not lost on Edmund. He had been released from Atascadero largely because of his intelligence, his ability to articulate remorse, and his seeming insight into his past crimes. Yet here he was, thrust back into the exact circumstances that had fed his earliest violence. A life dominated by a woman who reminded him constantly of his inadequacy. Far from calming him, the experience intensified his fantasies. The violence he had once acted out against his grandparents now returned to his imagination with new focus, this time directed not only at women like his mother, but at young women who represented the rejection and humiliation he so feared. Santa Cruz in the early 1970s was an unusual place to live. The city was home to two universities, and the influx of students gave the town a youthful, free-spirited atmosphere. Hitchhiking was common, not only as a means of transportation, but as a cultural expression of trust and openness. Students carried backpacks, guitars, and books, waiting by the roadside for friendly drivers to pick them up. To many, it was a symbol of independence. To Edmund, it was an opportunity wrapped in plain sight. Day after day, he drove the highways and back roads of Santa Cruz, often offering rides to hitchhikers. In the beginning, these rides ended uneventfully. He would take them to their destinations, exchange polite small talk, and watch them walk away. But the act itself, the moment they stepped into his car, the trust they placed in him, fed his fantasies. He learned to control his tone, to sound calm and harmless, to mask the inner storms that raged beneath. Each successful ride reassured him that he could pass unnoticed, that no one suspected the darkness he carried. But with each encounter, the temptation grew stronger. He began to think less about giving rides and more about what might happen if he didn't let them leave. He imagined pulling off the road into a secluded area. Imagine the panic in their voices. Imagine the total control he would have. At night, in his room at his mother's apartment, these thoughts grew vivid, rehearsed like a script he was preparing to follow. He also began to prepare practically. Edmund bought a gun, despite his history, and started carrying plastic bags, blankets, and other items in his car, objects that could serve multiple purposes but, in his mind, were tools for what was to come. He studied how to conceal weapons in his vehicle, how to lock the doors from the driver's seat, how to prevent a passenger from escaping if panic erupted. It was a chilling rehearsal, a slow and methodical preparation that turned fantasy into imminent possibility. What made Edmund particularly dangerous was the duality of his life. To co-workers and acquaintances, he was a gentle giant, sometimes awkward, sometimes withdrawn, but hardly a threat. He even befriended some police officers in Santa Cruz, chatting with them in local bars, discussing crime and law enforcement. His fascination with authority gave him insights into how the police thought, and he listened carefully when they spoke about investigations and procedures. The irony was bitter. Police officers who would later hunt the co-ed killer once shared drinks with him, never imagining that the man at their table would become the monster they sought. Meanwhile, his relationship with his mother worsened. Clarnell complained about his presence, accused him of being lazy, and told him repeatedly that no woman would ever want him. These nightly tirades reinforced the very obsessions Edmund had been nurturing since adolescence, that women were cruel, that they ridiculed him, and that the only way he could ever truly command respect or affection was through power. Her words became fuel for the fantasies that now consumed him almost daily. The escalation toward violence seemed inevitable. Edmund himself later admitted that he knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before he acted. He had rehearsed the scenarios, studied his opportunities, and sharpened the tools of his deception. He had already killed before, though his first murders had been within his family. Now he was surrounded by the very type of victims who populated his darkest fantasies. Young, trusting women who walked the streets of Santa Cruz with an openness that made them vulnerable to the man they thought was simply a helpful driver. What the world saw was a young man given a second chance, trying to piece together a normal life. What lay hidden was the mind of a predator, waiting for the moment when the barrier between thought and action would break once more. By 1972, the dam inside Edmund Kemper was ready to burst. He had spent years containing his fantasies, years rehearsing, years pretending. But each time he drove past a hitchhiker, each time his mother's voice rang in his ears, each time his loneliness weighed on him, the pressure mounted. Soon, the rehearsals would end. Soon, Santa Cruz would become the hunting ground of one of the most terrifying killers in American history. Chapter 5. The co-ed murders begin. By early 1972, the tension that had been building inside Edmund Kemper could no longer remain locked within fantasies. For years, he had practiced the art of appearing harmless. He had picked up countless hitchhikers, watched them trust him, spoken politely, and released them without harm. To the young women of Santa Cruz, he was nothing more than another driver. But to Edmund, each of those rides had been a rehearsal. He had studied how they reacted, how easily they stepped into his car, how quickly they let their guard down. He had refined his persona, the soft-spoken giant with an awkward charm, the kind of man who seemed incapable of violence. And yet behind this mask, he was preparing for the day when he would no longer let one of them go. That day came on May 7th, 1972. Two young women, Mary and Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, stood by the roadside in Berkeley, California, their thumbs extended in the classic gesture of hitchhikers. Both were students at Fresno State College, bright and full of promise, planning to spend the day visiting friends at Stanford University before heading to Oakland. The roads of California, alive with the spirit of youth and freedom, seemed safe enough for them. Hitchhiking was common, and for two women traveling together, there seemed little reason to fear. When Edmund pulled over, the sight of his enormous frame might have been intimidating to some, but his calm voice and polite demeanor reassured them. He offered them a ride, and they accepted without hesitation, sliding into the car that would carry them into the shadows of one of America's darkest stories. For Edmund, the moment carried with it a surge of power. The scenario he had rehearsed so many times was now unfolding in reality. He had two young women in his car, two lives in his hands, and for the first time since he murdered his grandparents, he was about to test the boundaries of his darkest fantasies. They drove. Edmund engaged them in conversation. His manner was not threatening. He asked them about their lives, their studies, their plans. The young women responded casually, unaware that every word, every laugh, was taking place under the gaze of a man who had already decided they would not leave his car alive. To them, he was simply a driver. To him, they were symbols of everything he had been denied. Instead of heading toward their intended destination, Edmund began to steer the car into more secluded roads. He had already planned his routes, already identified places where he could act without interruption. When the girls noticed that they were not heading toward Oakland, they grew uneasy, but Edmund's calm voice and excuses, claims of being unfamiliar with the roads, temporarily soothed their fears. By the time they realized something was truly wrong, they were trapped. Edmund had installed child locks in his car, ensuring that the doors could not be opened from the inside. It was a small but devastating detail, one that gave him total control over his passengers. When he finally stopped in a remote area, the reality of their situation became clear. He drew a gun, the sight of which shattered any illusion of safety. In that moment, Mary and Anita were no longer travelers on a carefree journey. They were captives of a man whose mind had been preparing for this moment for years. What followed was a chilling blend of calculation and brutality. Edmund subdued them, binding and silencing them before carrying out the violence that had existed in his imagination for so long. Mary was killed first, strangled in the confined space of the car. Edmund's enormous hands, symbols of his physical dominance, tightened around her until her life was extinguished. Anita watched, horrified, as her friend was murdered before her eyes. She begged for her life, but Edmund had already decided her fate. Moments later, she too was killed, her pleas silenced by the man who now sat in the driver's seat, calm and composed, as though nothing extraordinary had taken place. The murders of Mary and Pesci and Anita Lucchesa marked the beginning of a new chapter in Edmund's life, a chapter where fantasy and reality no longer stood apart. He had taken his first victims outside the family, two young women who represented the innocence and trust of an era, and he had transformed their journey into a nightmare. But Edmund was not finished. In fact, for him, this was only the beginning. He placed their bodies in the trunk of his car, a grim cargo hidden beneath the shell of his polite exterior. Driving back through the streets, he passed police cars, pedestrians, and other drivers, none of whom suspected that the young man in the car was transporting the remains of two missing college students. Later, he would describe the sense of power he felt in those moments, the ability to deceive, to hide in plain sight, to control life and death without anyone suspecting. When he returned to his mother's apartment, the horror deepened. While Clarnell slept inside, unaware, Edmund carried out acts that revealed the depth of his pathology. He desecrated the bodies of his victims, carrying out fantasies that had long occupied his mind. To him, the act of killing was not enough. It was the possession, the control after death, that fed his obsessions. The disposal of the bodies showed another side of his cold calculation. He dismembered them carefully, removing identifying features, discarding remains in different locations to hinder discovery. Parts of the girls were left in remote areas, while other remains were hidden closer to home. Despite the brutality of these acts, Edmund went about his daily life as though nothing unusual had occurred. He spoke politely to neighbors, reported for work, and even engaged in casual conversations with police officers he knew socially. No one suspected that the man they saw as a shy, awkward giant was in fact the killer of two missing college students. The disappearances of Mary and Anita were reported quickly, their families desperate for answers, their friends unable to comprehend how two vibrant young women could vanish on an ordinary day. In Santa Cruz and Berkeley, whispers of danger began to circulate, though many still dismissed hitchhiking as harmless. For Edmund, the lack of immediate suspicion only confirmed what he already believed, that he could kill, conceal, and continue without detection. This was only the beginning of what would become a series of murders that horrified California and etched his name into criminal history. But in May of 1972, with two young lives ended and buried beneath layers of secrecy, Edmund Kemper had finally crossed into the reality he had long fantasized about. The co-ed killer had begun his reign of terror. Following the murders of Mary and Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, Edmund Kemper's pattern began to take on a sinister rhythm, a blend of planning, opportunity, and psychological compulsion. Unlike many killers whose first act of violence is impulsive, Edmund approached each encounter methodically. He had tasted the thrill of absolute control, the ability to determine life or death, and it had confirmed something inside him that years of therapy and structured rehabilitation had never extinguished. The release from Atascadero had not cured him. It had simply sharpened his capacity for deception. After the initial murders, he returned to the roads of Santa Cruz with an outward appearance of normalcy. At work, he maintained his polite demeanor, sometimes joking with coworkers, sometimes quietly listening. At home, he endured the constant criticism of his mother, Clarnell, which fed a subtle, simmering rage he had learned to conceal in public. But in private, his mind was never idle. He began to meticulously plan future abductions, analyzing potential victims, studying their routines, and imagining the perfect scenario in which he would have total control. Hitchhiking became both a symbol and a tool. Edmund had observed countless young women traveling alone, unaware of the danger they might encounter. Their very trust, their assumption that strangers were harmless, fascinated him. Each time he picked up a hitchhiker, he practiced the same methods he had used before: calm voice, friendly smile, seeming politeness. The act of being perceived as harmless became as thrilling as the fantasies themselves. The more unsuspecting the victim, the more intense the surge of power he felt. By 1972, his confidence had grown exponentially. He could deceive anyone. Police officers, neighbors, friends, co-workers, even casual acquaintances, all saw the towering, polite young man as innocuous, if slightly awkward. Meanwhile, Edmund's inner world had transformed into one governed by precise patterns. He knew which roads were secluded, which areas were likely to have hitchhikers, and the best ways to ensure that no witness could interfere with his plans. He even studied maps meticulously, memorizing escape routes and hidden locations where he could carry out his acts undisturbed. The next victim was often selected not randomly, but deliberately. Edmund's fascination with control meant that he wanted to select someone who would embody both vulnerability and defiance, someone whose submission would confirm his dominance. Often, this meant college-aged women, traveling alone, walking along roads where his enormous presence could easily intimidate or impress. He knew that his size, nearly 7 feet tall, made him physically imposing, and he used this to his advantage, allowing his appearance to mask the predatory intent beneath. The abduction itself became an extension of his psychological dominance. Once inside the car, the victims often believed they were simply getting a ride. Edmund's voice remained calm, his demeanor unthreatening. He engaged them in small talk, listened to their stories, and occasionally feigned humor or awkwardness. Each reaction, each word, was an experiment in control. He measured fear and compliance, studying body language and voice. The thrill came not only from the act of abduction, but from the ability to manipulate the perception of others, to exist as both ordinary man and hidden predator simultaneously. As the murders continued, Edmund's methodology became increasingly sophisticated. He realized that leaving victims alive created a risk, so he focused on ensuring total control from the outset. He carried items in his vehicle, blankets, ropes, and sometimes weapons that could subdue or silence. He chose remote locations, areas with minimal foot traffic or visibility, ensuring that no interruption could occur. When the act of killing was carried out, it was swift and deliberate, designed to eliminate fear or struggle, a reflection of his obsession with efficiency and control. At the same time, Edmund continued to maintain his public persona. To neighbors and co-workers, he appeared calm, even pleasant. He discussed mundane topics with colleagues, laughed in the workplace, and presented himself as a towering but gentle figure. Occasionally, he would attend social gatherings, where he practiced conversational charm, aware that social approval provided both cover and validation. No one could suspect that behind the giant frame was a man driven by calculated bloodlust, a man whose fantasies of domination had become terrifyingly real. Each murder further reinforced his sense of invincibility. Edmund observed the reactions of the community and law enforcement as reports of missing women trickled in. To him, the authorities were largely incompetent, distracted, or misled by the lack of overt evidence. He had learned from his time in Atascadero the ways that people interpret information and the blind spots in human perception. Every police misstep, every dead-end investigation, became proof that he could act without consequence, strengthening his compulsion to continue. But beneath the surface, there was also a subtle tension. Edmund was keenly aware of the risk of discovery. He had been inside Atascadero once and understood what could happen if he were caught. This awareness created a duality in his mind. He had the drive to kill, but also the skill to evade detection. He cultivated patience, sometimes allowing weeks to pass between encounters, ensuring that his pattern remained difficult to trace. His intelligence, previously praised by psychologists, now served a darker purpose. It allowed him to calculate, plan, and manipulate both victims and society with chilling precision. By the end of 1972, Santa Cruz had unknowingly become a hunting ground. Young women who hitchhiked, who walked alone, or who were perceived as vulnerable had no idea that a predator of extraordinary size and cunning was observing, planning, and waiting. The first murders were no longer isolated incidents. They were the beginning of a series that would terrify a community and challenge the understanding of criminal psychology. Edmund Kemper had transitioned from a man with dangerous fantasies to a fully operational predator, blending intelligence, charm, and lethal force in a manner that would make him one of the most infamous killers of his generation. Chapter 6: The Hunt for Victims, Patterns and Predation. By 1973, Edmund Kemper had fully embraced the duality of his existence: the towering, polite young man to the outside world and the calculating predator in private. He had perfected the mask of civility, and now, armed with both intelligence and physical dominance, he approached the highways and backroads of Santa Cruz with a sense of purpose that went far beyond casual observation. Each day became an opportunity to study potential victims, to analyze patterns, and to refine the chilling ritual that had begun with his first murders. The term co-ed killer would later define him. Yet in those early months, the moniker was far from the public's mind. To Edmund, however, the pattern was clear: young, solitary women, often hitchhiking, often naive to the danger they faced, were the ideal targets. They were symbols of the freedom and independence he had never truly experienced, embodiments of the trust and openness that his own upbringing had denied him. And each encounter was both a rehearsal and a test, a way to confirm his ability to manipulate, dominate, and ultimately control life and death. Edmund had become a meticulous observer of human behavior. At the university campus, he would watch groups of students, noting who traveled alone, who walked confidently yet without awareness of their surroundings, and who seemed easily approachable. He noted routines, class schedules, bus routes, and the common practice of hitchhiking for convenience. Every detail was cataloged in his mind, forming a mental map of opportunity that would guide his predatory excursions. Driving along the backroads and highways, he practiced patience. Unlike impulsive killers who strike in sudden bursts, Edmund waited for the right moment, the precise scenario in which he could exercise total control. He looked for women walking alone or standing at bus stops, scanning for any signs of alertness, independence, or suspicion. Each potential victim was silently assessed for vulnerability, and each encounter became part of an internal rehearsal. His enormous stature, often intimidating, was balanced by a calm voice and approachable demeanor, a combination that allowed him to gain the trust of strangers who had no reason to fear him. When he picked up a hitchhiker, the ritual unfolded with chilling precision. The young woman would enter the car, perhaps exchanging a brief greeting. Edmund's tone remained steady, warm, conversational. He asked questions about school, work, or family, listening carefully to the nuances of her responses. He studied her gestures, the movement of her hands, the tone of her voice. The thrill was not simply in the act of abduction, but in the ability to manipulate perception, to appear harmless while wielding ultimate control over her fate. Once he determined that the moment was right, he would navigate to secluded roads. California's highways offered stretches of isolation, where traffic was sparse and visibility limited. These locations became the theaters of his cruelty, carefully chosen to eliminate witnesses and ensure compliance. His planning was not haphazard. It was the result of hours of observation, practice, and mental rehearsal. He understood the mechanics of fear, the psychology of submission, and the techniques necessary to neutralize resistance quickly. The murders themselves were swift and calculated. Edmund preferred methods that minimized struggle and maximized control. Strangulation was often employed, a method that allowed him to feel the power of life slipping away in his hands. His victims were rendered helpless, not merely by force, but by the carefully maintained psychological dominance he established throughout the encounter. To him, it was not only about killing. It was about mastering every aspect of the interaction, from approach to abduction to disposal. After the act, the processing of the crime became its own ritual. Edmund was meticulous in the disposal of bodies, often dismembering remains to obscure identification. He chose remote areas for burial or concealment, ensuring that discovery would be delayed. This methodical approach was consistent with the intelligence he had demonstrated since his youth. Whereas some killers act on impulse and panic, Edmund's post-crime behavior revealed planning, forethought, and the ability to compartmentalize. He could return to the normal world without leaving traces of the horror he had enacted. Meanwhile, in public, Edmund maintained his carefully constructed facade. At work, he was courteous and dependable, chatting with coworkers about mundane topics and occasionally joking. At home, he endured the scorn of his mother, whose criticism continued to feed his inner rage. The contrast between the man the world saw and the man behind the wheel of his car allowed him to perfect the art of concealment. Police officers, friends, and neighbors remained unaware that a monster in plain sight was actively preying upon the community. This pattern of predation was reinforced by his own reflections and observations. Edmund was fascinated by law enforcement, not merely to avoid capture, but to understand the limitations of detection. He had been inside Atascadero, where he learned the mechanics of psychological evaluation, manipulation, and control. Now, he applied that knowledge externally, studying police reports, reading news articles about missing persons, and observing investigative methods. He took care to act in ways that would confound authorities, using the intelligence and charm he wielded as effectively as his physical power. By mid-1973, Edmund's hunting was no longer experimental. It was systematic. The co-ed label, though not yet public, accurately reflected the demographic he pursued. He had honed a method of observation, selection, abduction, killing, and concealment that ensured the least resistance, the greatest control, and minimal risk of discovery. Each act strengthened his confidence, deepened his sense of invincibility, and solidified the grim psychological patterns that had governed his life since adolescence. In essence, Edmund Kemper had become both hunter and strategist. The highways of Santa Cruz were his terrain, young women were his prey, and his intelligence was the weapon that allowed him to operate undetected. The tension between his outward appearance as a polite giant and the inner reality of his predatory compulsions created a chilling duality. A man fully integrated into society, yet harboring a darkness that would shock the world when fully revealed. As 1973 progressed, Edmund Kemper's methods became increasingly refined, and the predictability of his actions began to establish a terrifying rhythm. He was no longer merely testing boundaries or acting on impulse. He had become a calculating predator, measuring each step with precision. The highways and byways of Santa Cruz, previously scenes of carefree travel for countless students, had transformed into the stages of his growing obsession. Every day presented an opportunity to observe, plan, and ultimately act, and Edmund's mind was consumed with the logistics of dominance, control, and evasion. His intelligence, once considered a measure of hope and potential by psychologists, now served a dark purpose. He studied the news reports of missing women in the region, noting how police interpreted or misinterpreted the evidence. He read case files obsessively, identifying patterns in investigative oversights, learning where authorities often failed to connect clues, and using these lessons to avoid detection. Unlike many killers whose arrogance blinds them, Edmund's brilliance allowed him to anticipate law enforcement responses, shaping his own actions to minimize risk. The young women he targeted were, in his eyes, symbolic extensions of his lifelong frustrations. They were independent, youthful, and often trusting, qualities that mirrored the freedom and recognition he had been denied as a child. Their very existence reminded him of the ridicule he had endured from his mother, of the social rejection he had experienced in adolescence, and of the isolation he had felt while confined at Atascadero. To Edmund, these women were both the embodiment of desire and the object of his latent rage. Killing them was not simply an act of violence. It was a psychological assertion of control over a world that had long marginalized him. By this time, Kemper's pattern had settled into a chilling sequence. He would scout areas where hitchhikers congregated, patiently observing their routines. Some days, he would drive past potential victims without acting, using the time to study their reactions, noting their demeanor, their posture, and even subtle gestures of trust or suspicion. When the conditions were ideal, isolated roads, minimal witnesses, and a target whose behavior suggested compliance, he would initiate contact, offering rides with his calm, almost disarming demeanor. Inside the car, the routine was precise. Edmund's immense size, nearly 7 feet, could intimidate, but he softened it with polite conversation and gestures of normalcy. He would engage the women in dialogue, asking questions about their studies, plans, and daily lives, all the while observing their reactions. Each answer, pause, and movement was cataloged in his mind, reinforcing the sense of power he derived from his ability to influence behavior without raising suspicion. To the victims, he seemed benign, even courteous. To Edmund, he was testing the limits of control and reinforcing the thrill of anticipation. Once the opportunity presented itself, he would execute the abduction with swift efficiency. The remote areas he had memorized were carefully chosen to eliminate witnesses and to provide complete privacy for his acts of violence. Strangulation, dismemberment, and meticulous concealment became hallmarks of his approach. Unlike many serial offenders who act out of impulsive rage or emotional triggers, Kemper's actions were calculated, almost ritualistic. Each killing reinforced his sense of mastery and deepened the psychological hold he maintained over both the victims and the broader environment. Even in the aftermath, Edmund exhibited an unnerving composure. He would return to everyday life, blending seamlessly into society. Coworkers observed a polite, intelligent, and unusually tall young man performing routine tasks. Neighbors saw someone gentle, if imposing, yet outwardly unremarkable. Friends and casual acquaintances perceived nothing threatening. This duality, normalcy in public, predation in private, was a key aspect of his methodology. He understood that the more ordinary he appeared, the less suspicion he would attract. It was a strategic exploitation of societal assumptions about innocence and appearance. The community, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the disquieting presence of a predator they did not yet understand. Reports of missing women circulated, creating anxiety among students, parents, and local authorities. Yet despite the mounting concern, no one could identify the pattern or link the disappearances to a single individual. Edmund's intelligence and careful planning ensured that he remained invisible, a shadow moving among the living while orchestrating terror in private. The thrill for Kemper was not merely in killing. It was in the orchestration, the rehearsal of control, and the manipulation of perception. He reveled in the meticulousness of his work, from the approach to the abduction, from the act itself to the disposal of remains. Each phase served a purpose, reinforcing the sense of omnipotence that had long fueled his fantasies. The psychological satisfaction of outsmarting both his victims and the authorities was a critical element of his compulsion. Interestingly, his engagement with law enforcement and the public only enhanced his sense of invulnerability. He interacted socially with police officers, spoke casually about crime, and even discussed investigative techniques, absorbing information while giving nothing away. This proximity to authority figures created a perverse sense of superiority. He could operate under the very gaze of those who were meant to protect society, yet they remained oblivious. It was a testament to his intellect, charm, and careful cultivation of persona that by the end of 1973, Edmund Kemper's pattern was clear: observation, approach, control, killing, and concealment. Each step was executed with precision, his actions both rehearsed and adaptive. He had transformed from a man with violent fantasies into a predator capable of implementing those fantasies with chilling consistency. Santa Cruz, with its free-spirited youth, open roads, and trust-based culture, had become a hunting ground perfectly suited to his skills, intellect, and obsessive desires. Edmund Kemper had not only crossed the threshold from thought to action, he had mastered the art of predation itself. The community remained unaware of the danger. The authorities remained confounded by the lack of evidence. And Kemper continued to navigate society as both giant and predator. His crimes were no longer isolated incidents. They were the methodical manifestation of a mind meticulously honed to dominate, deceive, and destroy. Chapter 7: Escalation, Confidence, and Control. By 1974, Edmund Kemper had become an expert in both deception and predation. His confidence had grown alongside his meticulous understanding of human behavior, and his public persona, polite, intelligent, and even somewhat charming, shielded him from suspicion. But beneath the surface, the compulsions that had driven him since adolescence had intensified. Each murder, each act of control over his victims, reinforced his sense of invincibility, and the thrill of dominance became the driving force in his life. He was no longer just acting on fantasy. He was perfecting the process, escalating both the scope and the audacity of his crimes. The escalation was psychological as well as physical. While previous murders had been calculated, they still involved elements of testing boundaries, observing responses, gauging reactions, practicing control. By now, Edmund's mind had internalized the steps so thoroughly that his actions had become almost instinctual. The observation of victims, the approach, the abduction, the act of killing, and the disposal of remains were no longer separate stages. They were components of a fluid, rehearsed ritual executed with precision. His intelligence played a central role in this escalation. He read constantly about law enforcement, criminal behavior, and investigative failures, assimilating knowledge to refine his methods. He understood the psychology of witnesses, the biases of investigators, and the limitations of forensic science at the time. Each insight became a tool, allowing him to adjust his behavior, avoid mistakes, and maintain the illusion of normalcy while continuing to act with lethal efficiency. The gap between public perception and his private reality widened, creating a dual existence that fed both his power and his obsession. The escalation also manifested in his choice of victims and the nature of his crimes. Kemper was no longer satisfied with solitary, low-risk abductions. He sought encounters that allowed him to exercise greater control, often targeting women who represented specific qualities: confidence, independence, or youthful vitality. These victims became symbols, proxies for the rejection, humiliation, and frustration he had experienced throughout his life. Killing them was not merely an act of violence. It was a psychological assertion, a reenactment of the dominance he had lacked as a child and the humiliation he had endured at the hands of his mother and society. In his mind, the rituals surrounding the murders were as significant as the killings themselves. He meticulously planned each encounter, calculating not only the abduction but the post-mortem activities. Disposal of bodies was deliberate and methodical, designed to delay discovery and complicate investigation. Dismemberment, concealment, and scattering of remains became standard practice, reflecting both his physical strength and his desire for absolute control. Each step reinforced his mastery over life and death, feeding a compulsion that had been growing for years. Simultaneously, Edmund maintained a facade of civility. At work with the California Division of Highways, he continued to be polite, cooperative, and helpful. In social settings, he was engaging and articulate, blending seamlessly into conversations about everyday topics. To co-workers and neighbors, he was simply a towering, gentle giant, someone who was striking in appearance but non-threatening in demeanor. This duality was central to his strategy. By appearing completely ordinary, he could operate without arousing suspicion, moving undetected in a world he simultaneously dominated and deceived. The tension between his public and private lives created a psychological pressure cooker. On one hand, he existed in a society that saw him as benign. On the other, he was driven by compulsions that could erupt at any moment. The presence of his mother, Clarnell, continued to influence his behavior. Her relentless criticism, her disdain for his independence, and her constant reminders of inadequacy stoked the fire of resentment and rage that fueled his fantasies. She was both a source of humiliation and a symbol of the societal rejection he had internalized, reinforcing the psychological templates that guided his predatory impulses. With each murder, his confidence expanded. He experimented with longer drives, more isolated areas, and increasingly bold interactions with victims. The thrill of control was compounded by the knowledge that he was unlikely to be caught. Each successful abduction and concealment reinforced his belief in his own invincibility. The pattern was becoming more audacious not only because he sought stronger psychological gratification, but because he had learned to manipulate perception so effectively that the risk of discovery seemed almost negligible that Kemper's escalating behavior was also evident in the psychological satisfaction he derived from post-mortem activities. He did not merely kill. He engaged in acts of desecration and manipulation, asserting total dominance even after life had been extinguished. These acts were private, hidden from the world, but they served a critical function in reinforcing the cycle of obsession. The power he exercised over his victims extended beyond the act of killing itself, encompassing control over memory, visibility, and the very narrative of their existence. As the months progressed, it became clear that Kemper's crimes were not random bursts of violence. They were the expression of a carefully honed system of predation. His intelligence, physical prowess, and strategic thinking combined to create a methodology that was both terrifying and highly effective. Santa Cruz and its surrounding areas, with their open roads, trusting hitchhikers, and youthful population, had become the perfect environment for his escalating compulsions. The community remained unaware. Police investigations were confounded by a lack of evidence, and Kemper continued to operate in plain sight. By mid-1974, the pattern was unmistakable. The killings had increased in both frequency and complexity, and Edmund Kemper's confidence had reached a level where he considered himself untouchable. The escalation was no longer solely about satisfying fantasy. It was about demonstrating mastery, refining method, and testing the boundaries of power in a world that remained oblivious. The giant in the shadows had grown not only in physical presence, but in the terrifying efficiency with which he preyed on the young women around him. As 1974 progressed, Edmund Kemper's confidence in both his method and his ability to evade detection continued to grow. With each successful abduction and murder, he internalized a chilling sense of invincibility. He had become adept at reading people, understanding subtle cues of compliance or resistance, and exploiting trust to lure victims into situations where his physical and psychological dominance would go unchallenged. The highways, the backroads, and even the small streets of Santa Cruz were now not merely thoroughfares. They were stages for his expanding reign of terror. Kemper's intelligence played a central role in this escalation. Unlike many killers whose actions are governed by impulse and emotional volatility, he applied logic, observation, and foresight. He studied police procedures, read news accounts of other murders, and analyzed patterns that authorities overlooked. Each insight was used to refine his tactics, making him increasingly difficult to detect. The duality of his existence, polite, towering figure in public and ruthless predator in private, was both a psychological necessity and a strategic advantage. Every interaction, whether mundane or significant, became an experiment in human behavior, and controlled, he began to expand the complexity of his crimes, selecting victims based not only on opportunity, but also on perceived psychological traits. Women who exhibited confidence, independence, or particular charm became preferred targets because they symbolized the social validation and autonomy he had been denied. Their abduction, subjugation, and eventual murder were, in his mind, a corrective act, a way to assert power over a world that had historically ridiculed or rejected him. Each act was a psychological assertion, a demonstration of mastery over both life and death. Kemper's meticulous planning extended beyond the immediate act of abduction. He anticipated potential witnesses, studied escape routes, and selected remote locations for his crimes. Inside his vehicle, he carried tools and materials that ensured control over victims, from ropes to blankets, allowing him to execute his rituals efficiently. The murders were not chaotic or haphazard. They were methodical, rehearsed, and executed with chilling precision. Strangulation remained a preferred method, giving him the sense of immediate and complete power over his victims. Publicly, Kemper maintained a facade of civility that was both disarming and strategic. To co-workers, neighbors, and acquaintances, he remained courteous and intelligent, engaging in ordinary conversation and presenting himself as a non-threatening giant. Social gatherings, casual encounters, and interactions with law enforcement were navigated with calculated charm. This duality was essential. The more ordinary he appeared, the less suspicion he attracted, and the more freely he could continue his predatory activities. The tension between Kemper's public and private selves intensified his psychological compulsion. On one hand, he existed in a society that viewed him as harmless, even admirable for his intellect. On the other, he was consumed by violent urges that demanded expression. The scorn and criticism of his mother, Clarnell, remained a constant influence, reinforcing feelings of inadequacy, humiliation, and anger. Her presence, though physically small in influence compared to the vastness of his crimes, symbolized the societal judgment and rejection that fueled his violent fantasies to be mid-year. Kemper's killings demonstrated an escalation in both sophistication and audacity. He began experimenting with the timing of abductions, sometimes targeting victims closer to populated areas, but executing the crimes in ways that avoided detection. He tested his ability to manipulate and mislead witnesses, measuring their responses and adjusting his approach accordingly. Each successful act reinforced the sense that he could act with impunity, further blurring the line between psychological rehearsal and lethal reality. The post-mortem activities were also increasingly deliberate. Desecration, manipulation, and disposal of remains became ritualized, extending his control beyond life itself. These actions were not random acts of cruelty. They were systematic, reinforcing his mastery over the victims and the narrative of their existence. To Edmund, the satisfaction derived from these acts was as significant as the murders themselves, consolidating his psychological dominance and perpetuating the compulsive cycle. Even as law enforcement struggled to understand the pattern, Kemper's interactions with authorities were calculated to exploit gaps in their knowledge. He maintained casual social connections with police officers, engaged in conversations about crime, and absorbed procedural information without revealing his identity as the perpetrator. This proximity to law enforcement enhanced his sense of superiority, as he was able to operate undetected while remaining in plain sight. It was a paradoxical blend of fearlessness and cunning, allowing him to escalate his crimes without immediate consequence. By the end of 1974, the escalation was unmistakable. Kemper's murders had increased in frequency, complexity, and boldness. He had perfected a methodology that combined intelligence, physical dominance, and strategic deception. Santa Cruz, with its trusting population, open roads, and student community, remained the perfect environment for his predation. The killer had evolved from a man driven by violent fantasy to a predator whose skill, preparation, and confidence made him nearly untouchable. The terror he inspired, though not yet fully recognized by the public, was growing in its impact. Families reported missing daughters, students disappeared without warning, and the community began to sense that something horrifying lurked behind the ordinary streets and highways. Edmund Kemper, meanwhile, continued to refine his rituals, explore the boundaries of control, and assert dominance with chilling precision. The escalation was complete, a giant in plain sight, both brilliant and monstrous, had become the architect of one of California's most infamous killing sprees. Chapter 8. The Psychological Profile. Inside the mind of a killer, understanding Edmund Kemper requires more than examining his crimes. It requires delving into the intricate, often disturbing layers of his mind. From a young age, his psychological development was shaped by rejection, isolation, and an intense need for control. Each experience, from his early childhood trauma to his time in psychiatric institutions, played a critical role in forming the mechanisms that would later manifest in his murderous compulsions. His case has fascinated criminologists, psychologists, and the public alike, precisely because it combines extreme intelligence with chilling acts of violence and a capacity for social manipulation that allowed him to operate in plain sight. Kemper's early life was marked by extraordinary contradictions. Physically enormous even as a child, he was painfully aware of his difference, which contributed to feelings of alienation. Social interactions were fraught with discomfort. He struggled to form healthy relationships and was often bullied or ridiculed by peers. At home, his family dynamics exacerbated his sense of inadequacy. While his father was largely absent and emotionally distant, his mother Clarnell was critical, overbearing, and psychologically domineering. Her constant belittlement instilled in Kemper a sense of powerlessness that would later fuel his violent fantasies. Psychologists studying Kemper's development have noted the profound impact of maternal abuse on his psyche. Clarnell's criticism, ridicule, and control created an environment in which Kemper equated female authority with dominance, humiliation, and danger. This association became a core component of his psychological framework. Women, particularly those who represented independence or assertiveness, became symbols of power and control that he simultaneously desired and feared. These early experiences created a template for the violent patterns he would later enact: domination, submission, and ultimately annihilation of perceived threats to his autonomy. Kemper's adolescence was characterized by intense psychological disturbance. He displayed early signs of antisocial behavior, including cruelty to animals, fascination with death, and ritualistic behaviors that suggested emerging compulsions. These behaviors were often accompanied by an extraordinary intellect. He was capable of articulate speech, reasoning, and self-reflection that belied his age. Yet this intellect coexisted with a growing obsession with control and violence, creating a duality that would define his adult criminal activity. The murder of his grandparents at age 15 was a critical turning point. It was not merely an act of violence, but a complex psychological event that fulfilled multiple needs simultaneously: an assertion of power, an outlet for rage toward authority figures, and a rehearsal of control that would later manifest in his adult murders. The methodical nature of these early killings, careful planning, execution, and disposal, demonstrated a capacity for premeditation that would become a hallmark of his later crimes. Psychologists have often cited this event as both formative and indicative of the trajectory that led to his serial murders. Kemper's time in Atascadero State Hospital further shaped his psychological profile. While the institution was intended to rehabilitate, it also provided him with a deep understanding of the human mind, social norms, and the mechanics of deception. He excelled academically and socially within the hospital, earning the trust of staff while simultaneously nurturing fantasies of control and violence. These years allowed him to refine his ability to manipulate authority figures, conceal his compulsions, and anticipate reactions, a skill set that would later facilitate his evasion of law enforcement. His intelligence and self-awareness were central to his ability to function in society while committing crimes. Kemper understood not only the mechanics of murder, but also the importance of appearances. He could blend into ordinary environments, maintain polite social interactions, and even establish casual relationships with law enforcement without arousing suspicion. This combination of high intelligence and psychopathy made him particularly dangerous. He was capable of foreseeing the consequences of his actions and adjusting behavior to minimize risk, while simultaneously satisfying his compulsions with ruthless efficiency. But Kemper's obsessions were highly structured. Victims were not chosen at random. They were selected based on psychological and symbolic significance. Young, independent women mirrored qualities he both coveted and resented, and the act of killing allowed him to assert dominance in a world that had consistently denied him power. Moreover, his post-mortem rituals, dismemberment, concealment, and manipulation of remains, demonstrated an extension of control beyond the moment of death. These behaviors suggest a complex psychological interplay between compulsion, gratification, and the assertion of mastery over life and mortality itself. Another facet of his psychological profile was the paradoxical interplay between guilt and pride. While he later confessed to his crimes and expressed a degree of self-awareness, there was little evidence of conventional remorse. Instead, his confessions were often delivered with clinical detachment, reflecting an understanding of societal norms and the expectations of law enforcement rather than an internalized moral compass. In essence, Kemper's intelligence allowed him to recognize the implications of his actions without necessarily experiencing empathy, a hallmark of psychopathy. Finally, Kemper's social adaptability reinforced his predatory capabilities. His ability to interact convincingly with peers, authority figures, and victims alike was crucial to his evasion of detection. He understood human psychology at a granular level, anticipating reactions, exploiting trust, and maintaining a veneer of normalcy even as he prepared to commit acts of extreme violence. This duality, charming, articulate, and outwardly normal in public, predatory and violent in private, made him one of the most fascinating and terrifying case studies in criminal psychology. Continuing the exploration of Edmund Kemper's psyche, it becomes evident that his criminal behavior was rooted in a complex interplay of intelligence, trauma, and compulsive patterns. Unlike impulsive offenders, Kemper's actions were informed by both a desire for control and a strategic understanding of the world around him. Every step, from selecting a victim to concealing evidence, was executed with a degree of premeditation that reflected both his high intellect and his ingrained psychopathy. To truly understand Kemper is to examine the convergence of early abuse, cognitive ability, and the unique pathology that transformed him into a serial killer of extraordinary infamy. A defining aspect of his psychological profile was his relationship with authority and maternal figures. Clarnell Kemper's relentless criticism and psychological manipulation played a pivotal role in shaping Edmund's perception of women as symbols of dominance and judgment. This dynamic was compounded by his experiences with male authority figures, who were largely absent or ineffective in his upbringing. The combination of maternal over-control, paternal neglect, and societal rejection instilled a deep-seated resentment that fused with his violent fantasies. Women, in particular, became both objects of fear and instruments through which he could assert power, a theme that persisted throughout his later murders. Kemper's high intelligence magnified his pathology. He was capable of sophisticated planning, abstract thinking, and strategic manipulation, skills that allowed him to execute crimes with meticulous precision. This intellectual ability also facilitated self-reflection, enabling him to rationalize his actions while understanding, at least on a cognitive level, their moral implications. The paradox of Kemper's mind lies in this duality. He could articulate remorse or fear of discovery, yet he continued to act on violent compulsions without empathy. His intelligence did not curb his predatory impulses. Rather, it enhanced his ability to satisfy them while avoiding detection. One of the most striking elements of Kemper's profile was his obsession with control. from adolescence, he exhibited behaviors indicative of obsessive-compulsive tendencies, ritualized patterns, and a need to dominate his environment. The act of killing, for Kemper, was not simply about ending life. It was an assertion of absolute authority. His post-mortem activities, including mutilation and selective disposal of remains, were extensions of this compulsion. The meticulous nature of these acts highlights a psychological drive for order and mastery, even within the chaotic and violent context of murder. Each stage of his crimes reinforced his perception of power and control, creating a feedback loop that intensified his compulsions. That Kemper's ability to blend into society was another critical facet of his psychological profile. Outwardly, he was polite, articulate, and socially competent. He could converse with strangers, maintain professional relationships, and engage with authority figures without raising suspicion. This social adaptability was not a byproduct of empathy. Rather, it was a learned strategy, a tool of survival and evasion. By mastering social norms and expectations, he created a mask that concealed his violent tendencies, allowing him to operate undetected for an extended period. His outward normalcy was a deliberate manipulation, a means of exploiting societal assumptions about appearance and behavior. Psychologists have also noted Kemper's pattern of escalating audacity. As his murders progressed, he experimented with increasingly complex scenarios, testing boundaries and refining his techniques. This escalation reflects both his growing confidence and the reinforcement of compulsive satisfaction. Early murders were rehearsals in control. Subsequent killings were exercises in mastery, each act building upon the last in both brutality and sophistication. His intelligence enabled him to analyze outcomes, adjust methods, and anticipate reactions, creating a cycle of refinement that heightened both his effectiveness and the terror he inspired. The intersection of sexuality and violence was another defining component of his psyche. Kemper's crimes were not purely about physical dominance. They involved a deeply ingrained sexual component, intertwined with aggression, fear, and the need to assert control over his victims. Psychologists have suggested that these patterns were rooted in early experiences of rejection and humiliation, particularly in relation to women. The acts of post-mortem manipulation and desecration were not merely violent impulses, but expressions of a psychological framework in which sexuality, domination, and mortality were inextricably linked. Finally, Kemper's self-awareness was paradoxical. He possessed an acute understanding of both societal norms and his own deviance. He could anticipate law enforcement strategies, predict public perception, and manipulate interactions with remarkable skill. Yet despite this awareness, he was driven by compulsions that could not be restrained. This combination of intelligence, insight, and uncontrollable desire is what makes his case particularly chilling. He understood the consequences of his actions but pursued them regardless, demonstrating both rational calculation and deep-seated compulsion. In sum, Edmund Kemper's psychological profile is a study in contrasts: intelligence and pathology, control and chaos, charm and monstrosity. His early experiences of trauma, maternal domination, and social isolation combined with high cognitive ability to create a mind uniquely capable of predation. His crimes were methodical yet compulsive, socially invisible yet terrifyingly effective, and they reveal a level of psychological complexity rarely seen in criminal history. Understanding his mind provides insight not only into the mechanics of his crimes, but also into the darker reaches of human cognition, where intelligence and pathology converge in deadly harmony. Chapter 9. The Capture, Mistakes, Confessions, and Arrest. By 1973 and into 1974, Edmund Kemper had reached the apex of his murderous spree, confident in his ability to manipulate, deceive, and control his victims and the society around him. Yet even the most meticulous predator is susceptible to error, and for Kemper, it was a combination of personal hubris, psychological compulsion, and unexpected circumstances that would eventually lead to his downfall. His capture was not instantaneous. It was the result of a complex interplay between his own mistakes, law enforcement vigilance, and the psychological unraveling that accompanies even the most calculating minds when unchecked impulses collide with reality. That Kemper's crimes, though sophisticated, had an inherent risk. The sheer scale of his physical presence, nearly 7 feet tall, made him uniquely capable of overpowering victims, yet it also made him conspicuous. While he had mastered the art of blending into everyday life, the more he acted, the more the possibility of discovery increased. He had grown confident to the point of subtle recklessness, testing boundaries not only with victims, but with society itself. His behavior around law enforcement and within social circles reflected a complex mixture of bravado and obsession, a dangerous cocktail that would contribute to his eventual apprehension. The immediate lead that precipitated his capture was neither complex nor extraordinary. It was his own impulsive and uncontrolled behavior, an extension of the psychological compulsions that had driven him since adolescence. In the months leading up to his arrest, Kemper engaged in increasingly erratic interactions with friends, neighbors, and potential witnesses, exposing fragments of his deviance in ways that, while subtle, were detectable to those who knew what to observe. While the authorities had struggled to link him to the growing number of missing women in Santa Cruz, these interpersonal missteps provided critical insights into his mindset, revealing vulnerabilities in a personality that had otherwise remained highly disciplined and calculating. One of the most significant mistakes Kemper made was his increasing desire for recognition and validation. Unlike many predators who operate purely in secrecy, Kemper's intelligence and self-awareness cultivated a paradoxical need to assert dominance not just privately, but symbolically in the public sphere. This need manifested in interactions that drew attention, invitations for discussion, or confessions that were partially veiled. While his confessions were carefully constructed, they inadvertently created opportunities for law enforcement to begin piecing together the connections between the co-ed murders, the missing persons reports, and a man whose intelligence and physical presence were already noteworthy within the community. The arrest itself was catalyzed by a specific incident that highlighted the tension between compulsion and rational calculation. Kemper, having escalated in both confidence and audacity, invited his mother to meet a potential victim, a chilling reflection of the intertwined rage, familial pathology, and compulsive behavior that defined his psychology. The act of murdering his mother, which he executed with the same meticulous planning as his earlier crimes, immediately exposed him to law enforcement. Unlike his previous killings, this act carried a level of risk that he had not fully mitigated, an emotional intensity and proximity that made concealment nearly impossible. That Kemper's subsequent behavior during the aftermath of his mother's murder revealed both his intelligence and his psychological unraveling. He took deliberate steps to interact with police, not out of remorse, but to assert control over the narrative. His confessions were methodical, thorough, and chillingly candid, yet they were delivered with a sense of composure that demonstrated an acute understanding of societal expectations and legal procedures. In essence, he had created a situation in which he controlled the disclosure of information, revealing the full extent of his crimes while simultaneously demonstrating the cold precision of his intellect. The police, upon receiving Kemper's confession, were confronted with one of the most extraordinary cases in criminal history. The level of detail he provided, from the selection of victims to the methods of killing and disposal, allowed investigators to connect numerous unsolved disappearances and murders across Santa Cruz and surrounding areas. The confessions were not only revelatory, they were psychologically instructive, offering unprecedented insight into the mind of a killer who had operated in plain sight while maintaining the appearance of normalcy. Law enforcement quickly recognized the dual significance of his confessions: the immediate ability to solve cold cases and the opportunity to understand the psychological mechanisms underlying serial predation. That the Kemper's willingness to confess also reflected a complex interplay of narcissism, guilt, and compulsion. Unlike many killers who deny or minimize their crimes, he exhibited a need to articulate his actions fully, almost as if cataloging and analyzing them for both himself and others. This behavior underscores the paradox of his psychological profile, a combination of antisocial traits, high intelligence, obsessive tendencies, and a compulsion for dominance and self-expression. His confessions became a window into a mind simultaneously aware of societal norms yet entirely detached from moral restraint. The immediate impact of Kemper's arrest and confession reverberated through the Santa Cruz community. Families received closure regarding missing daughters. Students who had vanished were finally accounted for, and the police were able to assemble a coherent timeline connecting multiple murders. Yet beyond the practical consequences, the case captured national attention due to the extraordinary nature of Kemper's intellect, physicality, and psychological insight. He was not merely a killer. He was a methodical strategist, a sociopath who had used intelligence, charm, and social perception to evade detection while committing acts of extreme violence that in retrospect. The capture of Edmund Kemper underscores the delicate balance between skill, intelligence, and the inevitability of human error in the life of a serial predator. No matter how carefully a killer may plan, the intersection of compulsion, ego, and circumstance often creates vulnerabilities. In Kemper's case, it was the combination of maternal pathology, psychological escalation, and an overconfidence that ultimately led to a moment of exposure, one that allowed law enforcement to intervene, end his killing spree, and begin the complex process of understanding the mind behind the murders. Following the murder of his mother, Clarnell Kemper, Edmund's carefully maintained facade began to unravel. The very act that had symbolized his ultimate assertion of dominance also became the catalyst for his exposure. Unlike his previous crimes, this murder carried with it heightened emotional intensity and the physical reality of proximity to someone intimately connected to his own past trauma. In this moment, the interplay of compulsion, rage, and overconfidence created a vulnerability that even his meticulous planning could not conceal. The subsequent actions he took, both in confession and interaction with authorities, would ultimately define the end of his killing spree. Upon contacting law enforcement, Kemper demonstrated an extraordinary combination of composure and detailed knowledge. He provided a thorough account of his crimes, describing each murder with precision, including the selection of victims, methods of abduction, techniques of control, and strategies for disposal. His confessions were chillingly methodical, delivered with the detached calm of someone recounting a series of experiments rather than acts of violence. To investigators, this level of detail was invaluable, immediately linking numerous unsolved disappearances and murders that had confounded the Santa Cruz police for months. One of the most remarkable aspects of Kemper's behavior during this period was his self-awareness. He understood not only the consequences of his actions, but also the social and psychological impact of confessing in a controlled manner. Unlike killers who deny or obfuscate, Kemper seemed driven by a compulsion to fully articulate his actions, almost cataloging them as though they were objects of study rather than human lives. This behavior reflects a convergence of narcissism, intelligence, and obsessive-compulsive traits, creating a psychological window that allowed experts to examine the workings of a mind both brilliant and pathological. But Kemper's confessions also revealed a pattern of escalation previously hidden from the authorities. He openly admitted to the strategic evolution of his crimes, from initial acts of predation, which were somewhat experimental, to highly calculated murders involving manipulation, psychological control, and physical dominance. Each confession detailed the refinement of his techniques, his understanding of law enforcement limitations, and the mental rehearsal involved in every stage of his predatory activities. This level of insight was unparalleled, providing criminologists with one of the most comprehensive case studies of serial predation in modern history. The arrest itself, though the culmination of years of predation, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Kemper's own compulsions led him to cooperate fully, guiding police to critical evidence and explaining his methodology in exhaustive detail. His physical presence, nearly 7 feet tall and imposing, could have been a challenge for officers, yet his demeanor during the process was calm, almost cooperative, devoid of struggle. The juxtaposition of his towering frame and polite, articulate behavior underscored the duality that had allowed him to evade detection for so long. A man capable of extreme violence, yet outwardly appearing composed and rational. Once in custody, Kemper's interactions with law enforcement continued to display both his intelligence and psychological complexity. He was able to recount events with precise chronology, anticipate questions, and provide insights into his own motivations and the behaviors of his victims. This cooperation, though unsettling, accelerated the closure of multiple cases. Families who had endured months of uncertainty finally received answers, while investigators were able to reconstruct a pattern that connected each victim to a single perpetrator. The case became both a resolution and a study in human pathology, illustrating the intersection of intelligence, compulsion, and the consequences of long-term undetected predation. Psychologists analyzing Kemper's behavior during this period noted the remarkable combination of cognitive control and compulsive drive. While he meticulously planned his interactions and managed his outward appearance, he was also compelled by urges that often overrode caution. The murder of his mother is a case in point, an act of emotional intensity and symbolic assertion that simultaneously exposed him to discovery. The subsequent confession was both a rational strategy to manage the aftermath and a manifestation of his compulsion to articulate, control, and catalog his actions. This duality is central to understanding his psychological profile, an intelligent, reflective, and socially adept individual driven by violent obsession. The broader implications of his arrest extended beyond the immediate resolution of crimes. Law enforcement gained unprecedented access to the methodology of a highly intelligent serial killer, providing insights into victim selection, behavioral patterns, psychological manipulation, and post-mortem activities. Criminal psychologists, profilers, and investigative teams used the case as a benchmark for understanding predatory behavior, illustrating how intelligence, physical power, and social adaptation can combine to create a perpetrator capable of evading detection while committing extreme violence. Finally, Kemper's capture illustrates the fragile balance between meticulous planning and human fallibility. Even the most calculated predators are subject to error. Compulsion, emotional intensity, and overconfidence can disrupt the most sophisticated strategies. For Kemper, The culmination of years of careful observation, manipulation, and predation collided with the impulsive act of matricide and the psychological need to confess. In doing so, he not only ensured his own apprehension, but also provided law enforcement and the wider public with an unprecedented insight into the mind of a killer who had operated undetected while leaving an indelible mark on criminal history. Chapter 10: Life Behind Bars, Imprisonment and Reflections. After his arrest and subsequent confession, Edmund Kemper was processed through the California criminal justice system and ultimately sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For someone who had lived with a combination of intelligence, power, and lethal compulsion, life behind bars represented both a loss of freedom and a shift into a new phase of existence, a confined environment in which his intellect, reflection, and obsessions would continue to coexist. Imprisonment did not diminish the complexity of his mind. Rather, it provided a stage for introspection, observation, and a different kind of control over himself, his environment, and the narratives he shared with psychologists and criminologists. Kemper's transition into the prison system was unusual in the sense that he had always possessed a high degree of self-awareness. Unlike many offenders who struggle with adjustment, he was able to navigate the social and administrative structures of incarceration with remarkable adaptability. He quickly established a reputation among staff as a cooperative, articulate, and unusually intelligent inmate. His towering physical presence, which once inspired fear in his victims, now coexisted with a calm, reflective demeanor. Prison officials were often surprised by his ability to engage in rational discussion, psychological analysis, and even mentorship of fellow inmates in navigating the complexities of prison life. Within the confines of the institution, Kemper's intellectual and psychological abilities became a subject of study and fascination. Psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement personnel were given unprecedented access to a mind capable of both extreme violence and high-level cognitive function. He participated in interviews, psychological evaluations, and research studies, providing detailed accounts of his crimes, thought processes, and motivations. These reflections were not only methodical but often analytical, demonstrating his capacity to dissect his own behavior with the same precision he had applied to his crimes. This self-examination became a critical tool for understanding serial predation, the psychology of dominance, and the interplay of intelligence and pathology in criminal behavior. A central aspect of Kemper's life in prison was his continued engagement with the mechanics of his own psychology. He remained aware of the uniqueness of his situation, a highly intelligent, socially adept individual confined within a system designed to restrict freedom and control behavior. This awareness fueled both introspection and a sense of mastery within the prison environment. He could no longer physically dominate others in the way he had outside, yet he exercised control through dialogue, observation, and the careful cultivation of relationships with staff and inmates. His psychological adaptability ensured that, despite the severe restrictions of prison life, he maintained a sense of agency, intellectual dominance, and engagement with the world around him. That Kemper's reflections on his past actions were often chilling in their clarity. He could recount the motivations behind each murder, analyze the impact of his upbringing, and discuss the compulsion that drove him to kill. He acknowledged the influence of his mother, the significance of early trauma, and the reinforcement provided by his intelligence in executing crimes without detection. Yet these insights were coupled with an understanding of societal norms, legal consequences, and the moral framework from which he had long been detached. This combination of awareness and detachment is what made his reflections uniquely valuable for criminal psychology. a perspective that bridges the gap between pathology and cognition, between fantasy and action. In addition to psychological interviews, Kemper demonstrated an unusual ability to articulate complex concepts about human behavior, manipulation, and perception. He could explain why certain victims were selected, how he anticipated reactions, and the strategies he employed to maintain composure in public while committing acts of extreme violence in private. These accounts offered invaluable insights into the intersection of intellect and compulsion, revealing how cognitive skill can enhance the capacity for predatory behavior when divorced from empathy and morality. His commentary on his own mind provided researchers with an extraordinary opportunity to study the dynamics of planning, control, and psychological gratification in serial predation. Prison life also highlighted the social adaptability that had enabled him to evade detection for so long. Kemper interacted effectively with a variety of individuals, from staff to fellow inmates, using conversation and observation to maintain a sense of authority within the social microcosm of the institution. This adaptability mirrors the techniques he employed outside prison, blending into society, exploiting trust, and controlling perception. In the confined environment, these skills were redirected toward intellectual engagement, psychological observation, and self-directed reflection, illustrating the persistence of traits that had once made him a dangerous predator. Another dimension of Kemper's imprisonment was his capacity for self-control in contrast to the impulsivity that had characterized some of his murders. Within the structured environment of the prison, he could no longer act on violent urges, yet he engaged these impulses through analysis, discussion, and mental rehearsal. This ability to channel compulsive energy into cognitive reflection demonstrates the duality of his mind, a combination of restraint, self-awareness, and pathological insight that allowed him to navigate the constraints of confinement without losing engagement with the psychological patterns that defined him. Kemper's interactions with criminal psychologists and researchers were often collaborative. He willingly provided information, insights, and reflections, demonstrating an understanding of the educational and forensic value of his experiences. These contributions not only enhanced scientific understanding of serial predation, but also allowed him to exercise influence in a controlled environment. The shift from physical dominance in the outside world to intellectual and psychological engagement in prison exemplifies the adaptability, intelligence, and ongoing self-directed control that characterized his life behind bars. As Edmund Kemper settled into the routines of incarceration, his intellectual and psychological pursuits became central to his daily life. The prison environment, though restrictive, offered him a unique stage on which to explore his own mind, analyze human behavior, and engage with the world in ways that were previously impossible during his years as a predator on the outside. While his physical capacity for violence had been neutralized, the mental exercises, reflections, and controlled interactions became outlets for the same drive for mastery and understanding that had fueled his earlier crimes. One of the most striking aspects of Kemper's life behind bars was his ability to engage in profound self-reflection. Unlike many offenders who respond to imprisonment with defiance or withdrawal, he approached his confinement with a combination of introspection and intellectual curiosity. He meticulously analyzed the psychological, social, and environmental factors that had shaped his criminal trajectory. His reflections range from the impact of childhood trauma to the ways in which societal perception had influenced his methods. This ability to articulate and dissect his own behavior was rare, providing criminologists and psychologists with a living case study of serial predation, intelligence, and compulsive pathology. Kemper's interactions with mental health professionals and researchers were unusually collaborative. He offered detailed accounts of his thought processes during abductions, killings, and post-mortem rituals, providing unparalleled insight into the mind of a serial killer. More than simply recounting events, he examined the underlying motivations, emotional triggers, and cognitive strategies that had guided his actions. His reflections were not static. They evolved as he gained perspective on the consequences of his crimes, the patterns in his behavior, and the psychology of his victims. These contributions became invaluable for profiling future offenders and understanding the intersection of intelligence, compulsion, and social manipulation. That a notable feature of Kemper's reflections was his continued awareness of control, even in confinement. While physical violence was no longer an option, he exercised dominance through conversation, observation, and intellectual engagement. He could manipulate social interactions with staff and fellow inmates in ways that reinforced his sense of agency. This shift from physical assertion to psychological mastery illustrates a core theme in his life: the need for control. Where once he exercised dominance over life and death, now he wielded influence through intellect, analysis, and interaction, demonstrating a continuity of behavioral traits despite the extreme change in environment. Kemper also reflected extensively on the psychological impact of his childhood, particularly the influence of his mother. Clarnell Kemper's critical, domineering behavior left an indelible mark on his psyche, shaping his relationships with women and authority figures. In prison, he could examine these dynamics without the interference of daily survival or predation, allowing a level of insight that would have been impossible during his active years as a killer. He connected his compulsions to maternal resentment, feelings of inadequacy, and the obsessive need for control that had guided every murder. This self-analysis revealed the complex interplay between early trauma, personality development, and adult criminal behavior. Another dimension of his imprisonment was his engagement with broader psychological theory. Kemper avidly read case studies, criminology literature, and psychological analyses, often comparing his own behavior with other offenders. This comparative approach not only satisfied his intellectual curiosity, but also provided him with a framework for understanding his uniqueness within the landscape of criminal pathology. He demonstrated the capacity to recognize patterns, draw conclusions, and situate his actions within a broader social and psychological context, further highlighting the interplay of intelligence, insight, and pathology in his life. That Kemper's reflections were not solely academic. He also grappled with the moral and emotional consequences of his actions. While he did not experience remorse in the conventional sense, he acknowledged the suffering of victims and their families, often with a clinical yet perceptive understanding of its impact. His capacity for empathy was limited, but his awareness of societal judgment and the emotional weight of his crimes contributed to a nuanced perspective on accountability and consequence. This balance between detachment and recognition of impact reinforced the duality that had always defined him: a man capable of immense violence, yet able to analyze and articulate the consequences with clarity. The prison environment also allowed Kemper to continue exercising a form of control through self-discipline and routine. Structured daily life, rules, and constraints provided a framework within which he could explore his mental and intellectual pursuits. He maintained a careful balance of engagement and withdrawal, using his interactions selectively to assert dominance, share insight, or contribute to research. Even in confinement, the compulsion for mastery persisted, manifesting in ways that were psychologically significant but no longer physically destructive. Over time, Kemper's life behind bars became a study in adaptation. He had transitioned from a predatory, violent presence in society to an intellectual and psychological force within the prison system. His reflections, analysis, and interactions demonstrated that the compulsions which had once manifested as murder could be channeled into observation, insight, and study. While the consequences of his crimes remained permanent and tragic, his ability to provide understanding to criminal psychology, law enforcement, and society at large became an unexpected legacy of his confinement that in sum. Edmund Kemper's imprisonment highlights the enduring influence of intelligence, compulsion, and psychological complexity. Stripped of physical freedom, he adapted, reflecting deeply on his past actions, understanding patterns in human behavior, and providing insight that continues to inform criminal profiling. Life behind bars became both a containment of danger and a stage for intellectual mastery, a paradoxical environment where the mind of a notorious killer could be studied, understood, and perhaps partially controlled. Chapter 11. Interviews and Insights. Conversations with a Killer. After his incarceration, Edmund Kemper became one of the most studied figures in modern criminal psychology. Law enforcement officials, criminologists, and psychologists alike were drawn to his extraordinary intellect and detailed self-awareness. Unlike many serial offenders who remain reticent or defensive, Kemper displayed a willingness to discuss his crimes, motivations, and psychological state with an almost clinical detachment. These interviews would become a window into the mind of a killer who had committed some of the most horrifying crimes in California, providing rare insight into the intersection of intelligence, pathology, and social behavior. Kemper's interviews were remarkable not only for the information they provided, but for the insight they offered into his thinking process. He spoke in calm, articulate tones, recounting details of his murders with precision and clarity. For psychologists, this was a goldmine. He described victim selection, methods of control, and post-mortem behaviors in ways that illuminated patterns of predatory behavior rarely accessible to researchers. Each description was not simply a narrative of action, but an analysis of cause, effect, and psychological gratification. His words provided context to behaviors that otherwise might have seemed random or purely impulsive. That a critical theme that emerged from these interviews was the influence of his upbringing. Kemper reflected extensively on his childhood, discussing how maternal domination, paternal absence, and social rejection had shaped his understanding of authority and power. He connected these experiences directly to his violent tendencies, demonstrating a level of self-awareness that is unusual in offenders. He described how feelings of inadequacy and humiliation, when combined with physical size and intelligence, created an internal drive for dominance. Every act of violence, he explained, was a calculated attempt to regain the control he had felt deprived of as a child. Kemper also detailed his compulsive need for control over his victims. He explained the psychological satisfaction derived from selecting, abducting, and ultimately dominating individuals who represented qualities he both desired and resented. This sense of control extended beyond the act of killing, manifesting in post-mortem behaviors and rituals. His ability to articulate these compulsions in interviews allowed researchers to understand the deeper psychological frameworks that underlie serial predation, how obsession, power dynamics, and pathological desires intersect to create a cycle of violent behavior. One of the most chilling aspects revealed in these interviews was his insight into the duality of his personality. Kemper openly discussed the contrast between his outwardly normal, socially adept persona and his private life as a violent predator. He recognized the strategic utility of his charm and intelligence in evading detection, explaining how he blended into society, engaged with authority figures, and maintained relationships without raising suspicion. This self-reflection highlighted a disturbing but fascinating facet of his mind. He understood human behavior at a sophisticated level and used that understanding to manipulate, deceive, and ultimately dominate. That Kemper's interactions with interviewers were not simply transactional. They were also analytical exercises. He often dissected the questions themselves, exploring not only the psychological intent behind inquiries, but also the assumptions and expectations embedded within them. This meta-analysis of conversation exemplifies the depth of his intellect, revealing a mind capable of anticipating, manipulating, and responding to social cues in ways that extended even to formal interrogations. Psychologists studying him noted that this ability to reflect on both his actions and the perceptions of others made him an extraordinarily instructive subject. The interviews also shed light on the escalation of his crimes. Kemper described how initial impulses and fantasies evolved into structured patterns of behavior, increasing in sophistication and audacity over time. He discussed how each successful murder reinforced his sense of invincibility, confidence, and control. These reflections revealed the mechanisms of reinforcement in serial predation, how repeated acts of violence provide psychological reward, embolden subsequent crimes, and establish a pattern that becomes progressively more dangerous. This understanding has been pivotal in shaping modern theories about the progression of serial killers and the early warning signs that may precede violent escalation. Another important theme that emerged from Kemper's conversations was his fascination with mortality and human vulnerability. He described the psychological thrill of absolute control over life and death, explaining how the act of taking a life provided an unparalleled sense of mastery. Yet these discussions were not laced with emotional outbursts or overt rage. They were clinical, precise, and reflective. His ability to articulate these dynamics with detachment allowed researchers to explore the nuanced interplay between intellect, emotion, and compulsion in a serial killer's mind. That Kemper's willingness to engage deeply with his own psychological profile made him a unique case study. Unlike many offenders, he could provide both descriptive and analytical perspectives, explaining what he did, why he did it, and how his mind structured these behaviors. This dual perspective, action and reflection, has informed countless studies in criminal psychology, law enforcement profiling, and the understanding of psychopathy. His contributions extend beyond individual crimes to offer a broader understanding of human behavior, control, and the mechanisms underlying compulsive violence. Finally, Kemper's interviews demonstrated the delicate balance between insight and pathology. He could discuss, analyze, and even theorize about his own behavior without diminishing the underlying danger and destructive capacity of his actions. This paradox, the coexistence of brilliance and depravity, provides an enduring lesson in criminal psychology. Intelligence and self-awareness do not necessarily mitigate compulsion, empathy, or destructive tendencies. Kemper's reflections remain a profound and unsettling testament to the complexity of the human mind when intellect and pathology intersect. As the interviews with Edmund Kemper continued, a deeper understanding of his unique psychological landscape emerged. Beyond the surface-level details of his crimes, Kemper demonstrated an ability to analyze human behavior with a precision and clarity that few others could match. His insights were not limited to the mechanics of murder. They encompassed social interactions, psychological vulnerabilities, and the subtle dynamics of power and control. For psychologists and criminologists, these interviews were invaluable, a rare glimpse into the cognitive processes of a serial killer whose intellect amplified his capacity for manipulation and violence. One of the most striking revelations was the level of self-reflection Kemper could achieve. He openly acknowledged the influence of his upbringing, particularly the psychological impact of his mother's domineering nature. He described how maternal control instilled feelings of inadequacy and fueled resentment, which later became intertwined with his violent fantasies. This recognition of cause and effect, the ability to connect childhood trauma to adult behavior, is unusual among serial offenders. In these conversations, he examined not only his personal history, but also the broader implications of familial dynamics on criminal development, offering a template for understanding the origins of violent pathology. Kemper's intelligence allowed him to articulate the intersection of fantasy and compulsion in a way that was rare even among studied offenders. He discussed how early thoughts of violence and dominance gradually solidified into concrete plans, detailing the psychological process by which abstract desires became actionable behaviors. This gradual escalation reflected both reinforcement and refinement, patterns that he described with precision. Psychologists were particularly interested in his ability to isolate triggers, rationalize impulses, and execute acts of violence with careful forethought. The level of insight he provided into the internal mechanics of serial predation remains a benchmark in the study of psychopathy and violent behavior. Another key insight revealed in the interviews was Kemper's understanding of social manipulation. He explained how he leveraged his physical presence, intellect, and charm to gain compliance and trust from both victims and authority figures. He dissected the nuances of conversation, body language, and social expectation, demonstrating an acute awareness of human psychology. This ability to anticipate reactions and exploit vulnerabilities was central to his success as a predator. In prison interviews, he could describe these manipulations not as bragging, but as analytical observations, providing a lens into the strategic mind of a killer who had operated in plain sight while evading detection. Kemper also discussed the psychological reinforcement inherent in his crimes. Each murder, he explained, provided a form of gratification that extended beyond physical or sexual pleasure. It was an assertion of control, a completion of a personal ritual that validated his sense of power. His post-mortem activities, including mutilation and manipulation, were described as extensions of this reinforcement, a methodical exercise in dominance over life, death, and his environment. By articulating these behaviors, he provided rare insights into the compulsion-driven nature of serial predation, highlighting how psychological rewards can entrench destructive patterns over time. Throughout these conversations, the paradox of his personality became increasingly apparent. Kemper could express empathy in abstract terms, recognizing the impact of his crimes on victims' families and the broader community. Yet this empathy did not diminish his compulsions or moral detachment. He could reflect on societal norms, anticipate judgment, and acknowledge consequences without internalizing conventional guilt. This duality, awareness without emotional constraint, illustrates a core characteristic of psychopathy: the ability to cognitively comprehend morality while remaining emotionally unaffected by it. Kemper also provided valuable commentary on the escalation of serial behavior. He recounted how initial impulses, once indulged and rewarded, evolved into increasingly elaborate strategies. He described the mental rehearsal, risk assessment, and iterative refinement involved in each subsequent murder, offering a detailed map of how compulsive patterns escalate when left unchecked. These insights were crucial for criminal profiling, providing law enforcement and psychologists with a framework to understand the warning signs, behavioral patterns, and cognitive processes that precede repeated acts of predation. The interviews also highlighted Kemper's fascination with mortality and vulnerability. He spoke candidly about the psychological thrill of absolute power over life and death, the clarity of control that comes with executing a plan flawlessly, and the mental satisfaction derived from completing each ritual. Yet, even in discussing these acts, his tone remained calm, analytical, and reflective. This clinical detachment allowed researchers to separate the psychological mechanics of predation from the emotional horror of the crimes, providing a more objective understanding of the underlying pathology. Beyond the analysis of past behavior, Kemper offered speculative insights into the minds of other offenders. Drawing on his own experiences, he theorized about patterns of escalation, compulsion, and manipulation that might apply to other serial predators. His perspectives were particularly valuable because they combined lived experience with intellectual reflection, bridging the gap between practice and theory in a way that few subjects could achieve. These contributions have informed both academic research and practical law enforcement strategies for decades. Ultimately, the interviews with Kemper serve as a case study in extreme intelligence, psychological complexity, and the chilling combination of self-awareness and moral detachment. He articulated not only what he did, but why he did it, and how his mind structured the interplay of compulsion, strategy, and control. For criminologists, law enforcement, and the public, these conversations remain a rare and unsettling window into the mind of a killer whose intellect magnified the scope and precision of his crimes, while his pathology ensured their devastating impact. Chapter 12: Victims and Modus Operandi. The Patterns of a Serial Killer. Understanding Edmund Kemper requires an examination of the victims he targeted and the methods he employed, revealing patterns that combine both chilling calculation and compulsive behavior. Kemper's selection process was neither random nor purely opportunistic. It reflected a combination of psychological fixation, personal history, and situational awareness. Each victim represented more than a physical target. They embodied unresolved trauma, power dynamics, and fantasies of control that had been incubating since his earliest experiences of abuse and rejection. That Kemper's early victims were predominantly young women, often co-eds or individuals who reflected aspects of his personal history, particularly women who resembled his mother in appearance or demeanor. This pattern of victim selection highlights a psychological strategy rooted in both resentment and projection. Women became symbols of authority, domination, and perceived humiliation, and the act of targeting them allowed Kemper to assert power over the aspects of his life he could not control. These choices were not accidental. They were deliberate reflections of the intersections between compulsion, obsession, and unresolved childhood trauma. The methods Kemper employed were both sophisticated and ritualistic. He often lured victims under the guise of casual encounters, conversations, or rides, exploiting their trust and his physical presence. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, he used his stature to project both strength and authority, creating a psychological leverage that minimized resistance. Once control was established, he executed his crimes with meticulous precision, often engaging in behaviors designed to assert dominance and satisfy psychological compulsions. These actions range from abduction to post-mortem manipulation, each step carefully calibrated to achieve maximum control and reinforcement. That a signature aspect of Kemper's modus operandi was the post-mortem behavior he engaged in, which extended beyond simple murder into acts of desecration and ritual. These actions were not arbitrary. They were expressions of power, psychological gratification, and compulsion. By controlling both life and death, he enacted a form of psychological mastery over his victims, turning each encounter into a complex interplay of dominance and fantasy. Researchers studying these patterns have emphasized the importance of post-mortem activity in understanding the compulsive and ritualistic elements of serial predation, particularly in individuals with high intelligence and obsessive tendencies. Kemper's physical dominance facilitated his ability to control victims with minimal struggle, yet he did not rely solely on brute force. His intelligence allowed him to manipulate, deceive, and psychologically coerce victims into compliance. He could read body language, gauge emotional responses, and adapt his approach in real time to reduce risk. This combination of strategic thinking and physical capability made him a uniquely effective predator, capable of executing complex abductions and murders with a calculated efficiency that minimized exposure and maximized control. The geographic patterns of his crimes further illuminate his operational strategy. Kemper typically targeted locations within Santa Cruz and surrounding areas, exploiting familiar routes, secluded areas, and opportunities for concealment. This geographic consistency reflects both a comfort with known territory and an understanding of environmental factors that reduce the risk of detection. By operating within familiar settings, he was able to plan encounters, assess escape routes, and manipulate situational variables to his advantage. These spatial considerations highlight the calculated, rather than purely impulsive, nature of his predation. That Kemper's selection of victims also demonstrates a methodical escalation in confidence and complexity. Initial encounters were often less structured, reflecting experimentation and observation. As he gained experience, his methods became increasingly deliberate, incorporating psychological manipulation, situational awareness, and post-mortem ritual. This pattern of escalation is consistent with broader criminological understandings of serial predation, in which reinforcement from early acts of violence encourages refinement, audacity, and greater sophistication in subsequent crimes. Another defining feature of his modus operandi was the psychological engagement he maintained with victims. Kemper frequently exploited fear, compliance, and confusion to enhance his sense of control. He described in interviews how he could assess a victim's psychological state almost instantly, adjusting his approach to maintain dominance and minimize resistance. This combination of observation, manipulation, and premeditation reflects the sophisticated cognitive processing underlying his predatory behavior, illustrating how intelligence and pathology can converge to create highly effective, controlled acts of violence. The selection of co-ed victims in particular highlights the intersection of personal psychology and opportunity. These individuals often embodied traits that triggered unresolved psychological conflicts related to Kemper's upbringing and experiences with maternal authority. By targeting women who evoked aspects of his mother, he recreated dynamics of dominance and humiliation, transforming each encounter into both a literal and symbolic act of control. This behavioral pattern underscores the complexity of his motivations, revealing that his crimes were not merely opportunistic, but deeply entwined with personal history, obsession, and fantasy. Finally, the consistency and ritualistic nature of Kemper's killings provided both predictability and structure to his otherwise compulsive behavior. Each act was both a fulfillment of a psychological need and a methodical execution of a personal template. These patterns allowed law enforcement, after his arrest, to reconstruct timelines, connect unsolved cases, and understand the methodology behind his predation. The combination of physical dominance, strategic intelligence, psychological manipulation, and ritualized behavior positions Kemper as a uniquely instructive case study in serial predation. As investigators delved deeper into Edmund Kemper's crimes, patterns in victimology and methodology became strikingly apparent. Each encounter, though outwardly unique, shared core psychological and operational elements that reveal the intricacies of his predatory mindset. Understanding these patterns is critical not only for comprehending Kemper's criminal behavior, but also for studying the underlying mechanics of serial predation, particularly when intelligence, obsession, and compulsion converge in a single individual. Kemper's victims, predominantly young women, were selected based on a combination of appearance, circumstance, and perceived vulnerability. Many were college students or young adults who frequented locations such as bus stops, public transit routes, or isolated areas of Santa Cruz. He leveraged both opportunity and observation, identifying individuals who matched psychological profiles he found compelling. These profiles were not merely superficial. They reflected traits connected to unresolved familial dynamics and personal fantasies, particularly those related to maternal figures and female authority. This deliberate selection process demonstrates the cognitive sophistication underlying his predation, illustrating that his crimes were not random, but strategically oriented to satisfy complex psychological compulsions. Once a victim was identified, Kemper's approach was calculated and adaptive. He often employed social skills, charm, and conversational strategies to gain trust, masking his true intentions beneath a veneer of normalcy. His towering physical presence, nearly 7 feet in height, could have served as intimidation, yet he balanced this with an ability to appear approachable and non-threatening. The interplay between physical dominance and social tact exemplifies his unique blend of intelligence and instinct, allowing him to manipulate environments, assess risk, and execute abductions with minimal resistance. Kemper's methods extended beyond the initial abduction, encompassing psychological manipulation and meticulous control over the victim's environment. He understood how fear, compliance, and confusion could be leveraged to assert dominance, often engaging in dialogue or psychological cues to reinforce helplessness. These actions reveal a mind attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, capable of anticipating reactions and adjusting strategies in real time. The precision of these interactions underscores the calculated nature of his crimes, illustrating how cognitive awareness and pathological compulsions intersect to produce highly effective predatory behavior. A significant component of Kemper's modus operandi was the post-mortem ritualistic activity he engaged in. These behaviors, which included mutilation, manipulation, and often positioning of the body, were not merely expressions of sadism, but served as psychological reinforcement for his sense of mastery and control. Each act provided a form of gratification that extended beyond the act of killing, consolidating power over life and death in a highly symbolic and personal manner. For psychologists, these rituals are invaluable in understanding how compulsions manifest in repeated behavior, providing insight into the reinforcement mechanisms that drive serial offenders. Geographically, Kemper operated within areas that were familiar and conducive to his objectives. By utilizing known routes, secluded spots, and locations with minimal surveillance, he maximized both the efficiency and safety of his operations. This geographic consistency is telling. It reflects a predator who not only considers psychological factors, but also environmental variables, demonstrating strategic planning and situational awareness. It also emphasizes the blend of instinct and intellect that characterized his crimes. He did not rely on luck, but rather on calculated assessments of risk, opportunity, and control. The progression of Kemper's crimes demonstrates clear escalation. Early incidents, while violent and calculated, were less complex than later murders, which incorporated increasingly sophisticated manipulation, planning, and ritualistic elements. Each successful act of predation reinforced confidence, enabling greater audacity and refinement in subsequent crimes. This pattern is consistent with criminological observations of serial offenders, where reinforcement through psychological gratification leads to iterative improvement in methods, sophistication in planning, and expansion in the scope of activities. Kemper's evolution from initial abductions to elaborate rituals illustrates this principle with chilling clarity. Kemper's understanding of victim psychology was particularly notable. He could predict reactions, gauge fear, and exploit compliance with uncanny accuracy. Interviews revealed that he studied behaviors, adapting his tactics to elicit desired responses. This skill set, combining intelligence with pathological compulsion, enabled him to manage complex situations with minimal exposure to risk. His manipulative capacity demonstrates a deep understanding of human vulnerability, power dynamics, and social perception, a cognitive edge that amplified the lethality of his crimes. Additionally, Kemper's selection criteria were influenced by symbolic connections to his personal history. Many victims reminded him of his mother, whether through physical resemblance or behavioral traits. This dynamic transformed the murders into a reenactment of unresolved conflicts, a method of asserting dominance over internalized trauma, and a mechanism of psychological satisfaction. By externalizing these internal conflicts onto his victims, he created a personal system of reinforcement that intertwined fantasy, compulsion, and reality. This interplay is critical to understanding the motivations behind his crimes and the symbolic resonance embedded within his methods. In conclusion, Edmund Kemper's victims and modus operandi reveal the terrifying intersection of intelligence, obsession, and compulsion. Each murder, while outwardly unique, was governed by recognizable patterns: deliberate selection, psychological manipulation, calculated abduction, and ritualized post-mortem behavior. These patterns not only facilitated the practical execution of crimes, but also satisfied complex psychological needs, reflecting the intricate mechanics of a mind that combined intellect, pathology, and a relentless desire for control. For law enforcement and psychology, understanding these dynamics provides both closure for the victims and insight into the mechanisms that drive serial predation. Chapter 13: Psychological Profile. Understanding the mind of Edmund Kemper. Edmund Kemper is often cited as one of the most psychologically complex and intellectually acute serial killers in modern history. Understanding his behavior requires an examination of the interplay between intelligence, compulsion, trauma, and social adaptability. Unlike many offenders whose actions are impulsive and erratic, Kemper exhibited a level of self-awareness and cognitive sophistication that amplified both the precision and the horror of his crimes. Psychologists and criminologists studying him have consistently noted that his mind represents an extreme intersection of intellect and pathology, a combination that both enabled his predation and offered a unique opportunity for insight into violent human behavior. From a psychological standpoint, one of the most significant factors in Kemper's development was his early childhood environment. His mother, Clarnell Kemper, exerted an unusually domineering and critical influence on him, fostering feelings of inadequacy, resentment, and rage. Psychological assessments suggest that this maternal control, coupled with an absent father figure, contributed to the formation of a personality characterized by obsessive thinking, internalized anger, and a compulsive need for control. These early experiences created a foundation upon which violent fantasies could develop and be reinforced over time. Kemper himself acknowledged the connection between his upbringing and his later actions, articulating a direct line from childhood trauma to adult criminality with unusual clarity. Intelligence played a central role in the architecture of Kemper's predatory behavior. Standing nearly 7 feet tall and possessing above-average cognitive abilities, he combined physical presence with mental acuity. This combination allowed him to plan meticulously, manipulate social interactions, and execute crimes with precision. His intelligence was not only operational but also reflective. He could analyze his own thought processes, anticipate law enforcement responses, and maintain composure during interactions that might have unraveled less sophisticated offenders. The coexistence of high intellect with profound moral detachment created a particularly dangerous individual whose actions were both calculated and compulsively driven. That a key component of Kemper's psychological profile is his obsessive-compulsive tendencies. These traits manifested in multiple dimensions: fixation on particular types of victims, ritualistic behavior during and after murders, and an ongoing need to catalog, analyze, and articulate his actions. Psychologists examining his case often highlight the role of these compulsions in structuring his criminal behavior. His killings were not spontaneous eruptions of violence, but rather highly organized sequences in which every action, from victim selection to post-mortem activity, fulfilled both pragmatic and psychological objectives. The compulsive element created a framework that was both predictable and inextricably tied to his need for control and mastery. Another defining feature of Kemper's psychology is his duality, the simultaneous coexistence of social functionality and violent pathology. On the surface, he could appear articulate, charming, and socially adept. He could interact with adults, authority figures, and peers without raising suspicion, effectively masking his internal compulsions and violent tendencies. This social camouflage was critical to his ability to operate undetected, demonstrating a level of cognitive and emotional adaptability that is rare among violent offenders. Behind the facade, however, lay a mind consumed by dark obsessions, strategic planning, and a drive for absolute control. That Kemper's actions also reveal a profound preoccupation with mortality, vulnerability, and dominance. His crimes were structured not simply to inflict physical harm, but to assert psychological and existential control over his victims. The combination of intellectual understanding and pathological compulsion allowed him to execute murders with both meticulous planning and ritualistic satisfaction. Post-mortem behaviors, such as positioning and manipulation, were not merely expressions of sadism, but were deeply tied to reinforcement mechanisms that gratified psychological needs. These behaviors illustrate the complex layering of pathology, intelligence, and compulsion that defined his criminal persona. In addition, Kemper displayed remarkable self-awareness. Unlike many offenders who externalize blame, he could articulate his motivations, triggers, and thought processes in interviews and psychological evaluations. He was able to identify the links between his early trauma, maternal relationships, and obsessive urges. He described the internal tension between desire, compulsion, and intellectual restraint, providing a window into the cognitive mechanisms that allowed him to plan and execute acts of extreme violence. This insight makes him not only a subject of horror, but also a rare opportunity for scientific and forensic understanding. Kemper's psychological profile also reflects the interplay between narcissism and psychopathy. He possessed a grandiose sense of self, coupled with a lack of conventional empathy, which allowed him to commit acts of violence without experiencing ordinary moral restraint. Yet, he could analyze his own behavior with detachment, describing motivations and consequences in terms that were both clinical and instructive. This combination of self-aggrandizement, moral detachment, and cognitive sophistication is emblematic of psychopathic behavior, but is intensified by the compulsive and ritualistic elements that structured his crimes. Finally, Kemper's mind represents a case study in escalation and reinforcement. Each act of violence reinforced his compulsions, honed his strategies, and amplified his confidence. Psychologists studying his patterns have emphasized the importance of understanding this cycle, wherein gratification, reinforcement, and repetition create increasingly dangerous behavioral trajectories. By analyzing his own cognitive and emotional responses, Kemper offered a rare and unparalleled lens into the mechanisms by which serial predation evolves over time, providing lessons for criminal psychology, profiling, and preventive intervention. Continuing the examination of Edmund Kemper's psychological makeup, it becomes clear that his intelligence, introspection, and pathology combined in a way that allowed him to operate with extraordinary effectiveness and chilling detachment. His mental processes were not chaotic or purely impulsive. Rather, they were organized, reflective, and reinforced by compulsive needs. This rare combination makes his case invaluable for forensic psychology, offering insight into how cognitive sophistication can coexist with extreme violent behavior. The central element of Kemper's psychological profile is his relationship with authority. He grew up in an environment dominated by his mother, whose overbearing control and criticism shaped his perception of women and authority figures. This early experience created a deep-seated resentment and compulsion to dominate, which later manifested in his murders. Psychologists analyzing his behavior note that this dynamic fueled both his selection of victims and the meticulous control he exercised over them. In his own words, his crimes were often a reenactment of power struggles that had defined his formative years, an attempt to assert control in scenarios where he had once felt powerless. Kemper's cognitive abilities allowed him to mask these compulsions effectively. He could navigate social interactions with authority figures, peers, and strangers without exposing his internal impulses. This duality, an outwardly composed, intelligent individual and an inwardly compulsive predator, was central to his ability to evade detection. Psychologists often emphasize that this combination of self-awareness, social intelligence, and pathological compulsion is relatively rare but extremely dangerous. It demonstrates how mental acuity can magnify the potential for predation when paired with moral detachment. Compulsion played a critical role in structuring Kemper's behavior. Each murder satisfied not only a desire for physical or sexual control, but also a psychological need for ritual and mastery. Post-mortem behavior, victim selection, and the sequencing of abductions were all shaped by obsessive thought patterns. These compulsions reinforced themselves, creating a cycle in which gratification, planning, and repetition became interdependent. This understanding of reinforcement highlights a key component of serial predation, the psychological reward system that drives increasingly sophisticated and frequent offenses. Kemper also displayed characteristics consistent with psychopathy. His empathy was limited, his understanding of morality was intellectual rather than emotional, and he exhibited a lack of conventional guilt. Yet, unlike many psychopathic offenders, he could reflect on his own behavior, recognize patterns, and communicate insights in a highly articulate manner. This blend of self-awareness and detachment makes his psychological profile especially instructive. Psychologists studying him emphasize that insight into one's behavior does not necessarily translate to moral restraint. In Kemper's case, intelligence amplified both control and danger. An additional layer of complexity is found in his narcissistic tendencies. Kemper exhibited a grandiose sense of self, often referencing his intellect, physical stature, and ability to evade detection as defining aspects of his identity. This self-perception reinforced his compulsion to dominate, both socially and physically, creating a feedback loop in which personal pride and psychological need converged. Psychologists suggest that this blend of narcissism, psychopathy, and obsessive compulsion made him unusually efficient as a predator, while simultaneously heightening the ritualistic satisfaction he derived from each act. Kemper's reflective abilities also provided insights into the mechanics of escalation in serial offenders. He described how early crimes, once committed and psychologically reinforced, emboldened him to pursue increasingly elaborate abductions and killings. The feedback loop of gratification, confidence, and refinement illustrates a critical principle in criminal psychology. The combination of compulsion and reinforcement drives progression in serial predation. Kemper's articulation of this process, including the cognitive calculations involved, has been invaluable for law enforcement and profiling methodologies. Importantly, Kemper's psychological profile is not solely defined by pathology. His intelligence, articulate expression, and observational skills demonstrate cognitive strengths that coexist uncomfortably with his violent compulsions. He could analyze social dynamics, anticipate reactions, and manipulate environments with precision. This capability illustrates a broader point in the study of criminal psychology. Extreme intellect does not immunize against pathology. Rather, it can exacerbate the efficiency and destructiveness of compulsive behaviors. His case also offers lessons in the intersection of trauma, personality development, and compulsion. The combination of maternal domination, social rejection, and early psychological strain created a fertile ground for obsessive thoughts and violent fantasies. Kemper's ability to recognize and articulate these influences is rare and has provided researchers with a framework to explore similar developmental pathways in other offenders. The integration of personal history, psychological need, and behavioral manifestation in his profile represents one of the most comprehensive case studies in modern criminology. Finally, Kemper's mind exemplifies the paradox of insight without inhibition. He could understand the mechanics of his crimes, the motivations of his victims, and the consequences of his actions. Yet this awareness did not prevent him from acting on compulsions when outside the prison environment. His intelligence and self-reflection did not mitigate pathology. Instead, they enhanced his capacity to execute crimes with precision. This paradox underscores the chilling complexity of his psychological profile and the cautionary lessons it provides for the study of serial predation, risk assessment, and offender profiling. Chapter 14: Media, Public Fascination, and Cultural Impact. Edmund Kemper's story has resonated far beyond the confines of Santa Cruz, extending into national media coverage, true crime literature, and popular culture. The combination of his physical stature, intelligence, and horrifying crimes created a narrative that captivated the public imagination, offering both fascination and horror. Unlike many other serial killers, Kemper's ability to articulate his thoughts and motivations added an unprecedented dimension to his story, allowing the public, criminologists, and law enforcement alike to peer into the mind of a predator with both clarity and dread. The media's portrayal of Kemper often emphasized his extraordinary height, nearly 7 feet tall, a physical attribute that became almost symbolic of his predatory presence. Headlines and news segments highlighted his size in conjunction with the brutal nature of his crimes, creating an image of an imposing and terrifying figure. This fascination with the physicality of Kemper served to amplify public fear and fascination, transforming him into a figure both horrifying and strangely mythic. In many ways, his stature became inseparable from the narrative of his crimes, emphasizing the chilling intersection of appearance, capability, and pathology. Beyond physicality, the public was drawn to Kemper's intellect. Unlike many other offenders, He could articulate his actions, motivations, and thought processes with remarkable clarity. Journalists, criminologists, and documentary producers capitalized on this ability, conducting interviews and presenting his insights in ways that both educated and unsettled audiences. The articulation of psychological mechanics behind his crimes provided a new layer of fascination. Here was a killer who understood himself in ways that few could, and who could communicate that understanding to others with precision and detachment. This aspect of his persona reinforced both fear and curiosity, positioning him as a subject of study as much as of sensationalized media attention. True crime literature quickly seized on the details of Kemper's crimes, embedding his story in a broader cultural dialogue about serial killers, psychology, and societal failure. Authors and researchers explored not only the mechanics of his murders, but also the psychological and sociological dimensions of his behavior. Kemper's own reflections, interviews, and analyses provided primary source material that offered unmatched insight into the mind of a killer. This access made him both a cautionary tale and a subject of scholarly examination, bridging the gap between sensationalism and criminological study. Television documentaries and news features played a major role in shaping public perception of Kemper. Programs often combined interviews, reenactments, and archival footage to create a narrative that emphasized both his intelligence and his monstrosity. In these portrayals, Kemper was depicted as a highly articulate, eerily calm figure capable of dissecting human behavior with precision. Viewers were drawn not only to the facts of his crimes, but to the psychology behind them, creating a fascination that extended beyond horror into curiosity, education, and analysis. This media framing contributed to his status as one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. The public fascination with Kemper also reflects broader societal interest in the nature of evil and the psychology of killers. His ability to combine intelligence, articulate self-awareness, and extreme violence created a narrative that resonates with enduring questions about human behavior. How does someone capable of reflection commit acts of unimaginable horror? Can intellect coexist with pathology? Why are some individuals driven to repeated acts of predation? These questions, amplified by media exposure, transformed Kemper into a symbol not only of violent crime, but of the complexity and contradictions inherent in human psychology. The Kemper story also influenced law enforcement and criminal profiling. His articulate interviews and willingness to discuss his crimes provided insights that informed investigative techniques, behavioral analysis, and predictive profiling. FBI profilers and criminologists studied his patterns of victim selection, abduction, and ritualistic behavior to identify warning signs in other offenders. In many ways, public fascination intersected with professional utility. The same traits that drew media attention, intelligence, self-awareness, and meticulous planning, also offered a rare opportunity for forensic insight. This dual impact illustrates the unique position Kemper occupies in both popular culture and criminological study. Cultural representations of Kemper extend into film, television, and literature, where he has been referenced as an archetype of the intelligent, articulate serial killer. His influence can be seen in fictionalized portrayals of characters who combine charm, cunning, and psychological insight with violence. While dramatizations often take creative liberties, they draw heavily on the real-life paradox of Kemper, a man capable of extreme intellect and reflection, yet simultaneously capable of horrific violence. This archetype has shaped both public understanding and popular imagination about serial predation, reinforcing fascination and horror in equal measure. Public reaction to Kemper also reflects a deep-seated societal fear of the unpredictable predator. His crimes, particularly the targeting of young women, resonate with concerns about vulnerability, trust, and the potential for violence in everyday settings. Media coverage emphasized both the randomness and the calculated nature of his acts, heightening awareness and fear. At the same time, the public was drawn to his articulate explanation of behavior, creating a paradoxical fascination. Viewers were repelled by the horror of his crimes, but compelled by the insight into the mind behind them. Finally, Kemper's cultural impact underscores the enduring relevance of psychological understanding in crime narratives. He represents a case where pathology, intellect, and social dynamics converge in a way that challenges conventional notions of morality, intelligence, and evil. The fascination with his story, amplified by media, literature, and academic study, continues to shape both professional and public understanding of serial predation, illustrating how one individual's life of horror can inform broader societal awareness and insight into the darkest corners of human behavior. As media coverage of Edmund Kemper's crimes expanded, the public's fascination deepened, blending horror, intrigue, and psychological curiosity. The narrative constructed around him emphasized not only the brutality of his actions, but the extraordinary intelligence and self-awareness that set him apart from typical offenders. In this way, Kemper became a figure of both fear and intellectual interest, a subject whose life and crimes have been analyzed extensively in news reports, documentaries, and scholarly work. Television documentaries played a particularly significant role in shaping public perception. Producers highlighted Kemper's ability to articulate his thoughts, describe his crimes in detail, and explain the psychological motives underlying his behavior. These programs often juxtaposed archival footage, reenactments, and Kemper's own interviews, creating a multidimensional portrayal that emphasized both his monstrosity and his intellectual sophistication. Audiences were captivated by the contrast between his calm, almost polite demeanor and the violence he had committed. This paradox created a unique kind of fascination, blending fear with a desire to understand the mind capable of such acts. True crime books also contributed to the cultural impact of Kemper's story. Authors explored not only the factual narrative of his murders, but also the broader psychological and sociological implications of his behavior. His willingness to discuss his crimes and reflect on his motivations provided researchers and writers with a wealth of primary material. This allowed for detailed examinations of victim selection, modus operandi, psychological compulsion, and postmortem rituals. By offering these insights, Kemper inadvertently became both a case study in criminology and a subject of public curiosity, bridging the gap between academic analysis and popular media consumption. The fascination with Kemper is also tied to his physical presence. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, his size contributed to a mythic aura that was repeatedly highlighted in media coverage. This aspect of his persona made him appear almost larger than life, a living embodiment of fear and dominance. When combined with his articulate, intelligent speech, this physical presence reinforced the duality that made him so compelling, outwardly imposing yet highly cognitive, capable of both planning and reflection. The public's intrigue stemmed from this unusual combination, which amplified both horror and fascination. That Kemper's influence extends beyond media portrayal into the field of criminal profiling and behavioral analysis. His articulate descriptions of victim selection, psychological compulsion, and ritualistic behavior have informed law enforcement techniques and predictive models. The details he provided about planning, execution, and internal motivation have been incorporated into training materials and research, illustrating how media attention can coincide with practical insight. Kemper's story demonstrates that public fascination with serial killers is not purely sensational. It can also yield educational and analytical value when combined with rigorous study. The cultural impact of Kemper also includes his influence on fictional portrayals of intelligent serial killers. Many films, television series, and novels have drawn inspiration from his duality, the combination of charm, intellect, and extreme violence. Characters modeled after Kemper often embody traits that mirror his paradoxical nature: reflective, articulate, and socially adept, yet capable of calculated, horrifying acts. This archetype has become a staple in crime fiction, reinforcing public perceptions of the serial killer as both intelligent and terrifying, blending the realms of real-life horror with narrative intrigue. Public fascination with Kemper also reflects broader societal anxieties. His crimes, targeting young women and involving abduction and post-mortem rituals, resonate with fears about vulnerability, trust, and human cruelty. Media coverage amplified these anxieties by emphasizing both the randomness and calculated nature of his acts. The juxtaposition of outward normalcy with inner pathology created a narrative that was both compelling and terrifying, capturing the public's attention while raising awareness of behavioral warning signs and the complexities of human motivation. Moreover, Kemper's willingness to speak openly about his behavior created a bridge between horror and education. His insights have informed both lay audiences and professionals about the psychological mechanisms behind serial predation. Viewers and readers were not only exposed to the facts of his crimes, but also to an unprecedented window into the thought processes of a highly intelligent and reflective offender. This combination of accessibility and depth is rare, making his case a cornerstone in discussions of criminal psychology, media representation, and cultural understanding of violence. Kemper's story also serves as a reminder of the media's role in shaping the public imagination. By emphasizing particular traits, height, intelligence, articulation, and violence, journalists, documentary producers, and writers created a narrative that balanced sensationalism with insight. This narrative construction has contributed to both fear and fascination, illustrating how individual crimes can transcend the immediate tragedy to influence cultural perceptions of criminality, intelligence, and pathology. In conclusion, the cultural impact of Edmund Kemper extends across media, literature, criminology, and public consciousness. His extraordinary intelligence, articulate self-awareness, and physical presence combine to create a narrative that is simultaneously horrifying, educational, and captivating. Through news coverage, documentaries, and literary analysis, Kemper has become more than a criminal. He is a case study, a cultural archetype, and a lens through which society continues to examine the darkest corners of human behavior. His story endures because it challenges assumptions, provokes curiosity, and forces reflection on the intersection of intellect, pathology, and the human capacity for violence. Chapter 15: Arrest, Trial, and Legacy. The End and Aftermath. The arrest of Edmund Kemper marked the end of a decade-long series of murders and the beginning of an unprecedented examination of his mind, crimes, and legacy. His surrender to authorities in April 1973 was unusual in its own right. Unlike many serial offenders, Kemper did not evade capture through elaborate concealment or flight. Instead, he called the police himself after murdering his mother and her friend, reporting the crime in calm, precise terms. This voluntary admission signaled not only a turning point in his criminal trajectory, but also the start of an in-depth engagement with law enforcement, psychologists, and the public. Kemper's arrest initiated a process that would provide extraordinary insight into the mechanics of his crimes. Law enforcement officers, who had previously been aware of his connections to unsolved murders, were initially struck by the contrast between his physical presence, towering at nearly 7 feet, and his calm, articulate demeanor. This juxtaposition immediately drew attention. Here was a man capable of immense violence who could engage rationally, reflectively, and analytically. From the outset, his cooperation with authorities and his willingness to detail the steps of his crimes offered a level of clarity rarely seen in serial cases, setting the stage for both judicial proceedings and psychological study. During interrogation, Kemper demonstrated an extraordinary ability to recount his crimes with precision and introspection. He described the planning, execution, and post-mortem rituals in painstaking detail, providing investigators with both evidence and a roadmap of his predatory patterns. His narrative included not only factual recounting, but also psychological reflections, linking his actions to unresolved childhood trauma, maternal influence, and compulsive fantasies. This dual presentation, practical mechanics intertwined with internal motivation, offered law enforcement and psychologists an unprecedented window into the mind of a serial killer. The trial of Edmund Kemper, which followed shortly after his arrest, became a case study in both criminal justice and forensic psychology. The prosecution faced the challenge of presenting a coherent narrative of murder and mutilation while navigating the public fascination with his persona. Meanwhile, the defense and psychological experts examined the influence of childhood trauma, mental health, and compulsive pathology. The courtroom became not only a venue for legal adjudication, but also a stage for exploring the psychological dimensions of extreme criminal behavior. Blending jurisprudence with scientific inquiry, Kemper's cooperation during the trial provided further insight into his intellect and self-awareness. He answered questions calmly, without defensiveness, demonstrating a capacity for introspection that was remarkable even among criminally sophisticated individuals. His reflections on motive, method, and psychological compulsion were presented with the clarity of someone analyzing a complex system rather than a chaotic human being. These courtroom disclosures deepened public understanding of the intersections between trauma, intelligence, and pathological behavior, illustrating how criminal acts can arise from a convergence of internal and external factors. That a key component of the trial involved examining the nature of Kemper's mental state. Experts assessed the extent to which his upbringing, personality structure, and psychological disorders influenced his capacity for moral judgment and self-control. The case illuminated the challenges of distinguishing between cognitive awareness and emotional detachment, as Kemper demonstrated a full understanding of his actions yet remained emotionally unrestrained by conventional moral constraints. These assessments informed not only legal considerations, such as competency and criminal responsibility, but also broader understandings of psychopathy, narcissism, and obsessive-compulsive pathology. The outcome of the trial ultimately led to a conviction on multiple counts of first-degree murder, securing a sentence that reflected the gravity and premeditation of his crimes. Kemper was confined to a state psychiatric facility before eventual transfer to a prison setting, where he has remained under close observation. His incarceration has allowed psychologists, criminologists, and forensic researchers ongoing access for interviews, case studies, and analysis, cementing his status as both a notorious criminal and a subject of enduring scientific inquiry. Kemper's arrest and trial also had profound societal implications. The public was forced to confront the reality of extreme violence emerging from ordinary, seemingly benign circumstances. His articulate and reflective presentation challenged assumptions about what a killer looks like, behaves like, and thinks. For families of victims, The trial provided a painful but necessary resolution, while for law enforcement, it offered critical insights into investigative techniques, behavioral profiling, and crime prevention. The convergence of personal narrative, legal proceedings, and psychological analysis created a comprehensive framework for understanding not only Kemper's crimes, but the broader phenomenon of serial predation. Beyond the immediate legal and psychological context, Kemper's case influenced media, culture, and public awareness of serial offenders. Documentaries, news coverage, and literature highlighted both his horrific acts and his extraordinary cognitive faculties, creating a narrative that blended fear, fascination, and education. The trial, widely covered and scrutinized, reinforced the notion that understanding criminal psychology requires both empirical observation and careful analysis of individual history, motive, and compulsion. Kemper's own willingness to articulate his experiences ensured that his story would serve as a reference point for scholars, students, and professionals for decades to come. The legacy of Edmund Kemper's arrest and trial extends beyond the immediate outcomes of incarceration and legal resolution. His case has informed investigative protocols, contributed to the development of offender profiling, and deepened understanding of the psychological, social, and developmental factors that contribute to extreme criminal behavior. By bridging the gap between criminal action, psychological reflection, and legal adjudication, Kemper's story continues to provide lessons for law enforcement, forensic psychology, and society at large, illustrating the enduring importance of comprehension alongside condemnation. The conclusion of Edmund Kemper's trial marked not only a legal closure, but also a crystallization of his legacy within criminal psychology, media culture, and public consciousness. His conviction cemented him as one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, yet the implications of his case extend far beyond the courtroom. By examining the aftermath, we can understand how his crimes, trial, and reflections shaped investigative practices, informed psychological theory, and influenced societal perceptions of extreme criminality. Kemper's incarceration provided an unprecedented opportunity for ongoing study. Unlike many offenders, he remained articulate, cooperative, and willing to reflect on his behavior. This accessibility allowed psychologists, criminologists, and law enforcement professionals to conduct longitudinal studies of a living serial killer, tracking not only behavioral patterns, but also cognitive processes and psychological evolution over time. His insights into compulsive behavior, victim selection, and ritualistic tendencies became cornerstone references in forensic psychology, shaping the way experts understand the internal drivers of serial predation. The impact of his case on law enforcement methodology cannot be overstated. The detailed confessions, insights into decision-making, and reflections on psychological compulsion offered guidance for profiling future offenders. Investigators could study his operational patterns, abduction methods, geographic familiarity, post-mortem behaviors, and incorporate these lessons into training programs and case studies. The tangible, first-hand information provided by Kemper created a blueprint that has influenced both criminal investigations and preventive strategies, underscoring the critical importance of understanding offender psychology in real-world law enforcement contexts. Culturally, Kemper's legacy is intertwined with the fascination society holds for serial killers. His combination of extraordinary height, intellectual capacity, articulate speech, and horrific acts created a narrative that captured both fear and intrigue. He became a reference point in media portrayals of the intelligent serial killer, influencing documentaries, true crime series, and fictionalized characters in film and literature. These representations often emphasize the paradoxical elements of his persona, calm yet violent, reflective yet compulsive, intelligent yet morally detached. This archetype has persisted in cultural consciousness because it challenges conventional assumptions about who commits extreme crimes and why. The trial and its aftermath also highlighted the intersection of legal, psychological, and ethical considerations. Kemper's articulate self-analysis provided insights into the degree of responsibility, awareness, and moral judgment an offender can possess. Courts, psychologists, and the public were confronted with the difficult task of separating comprehension from morality. He fully understood the consequences of his actions, yet the compulsions and psychological drivers behind them overrode empathy and moral restraint. This complexity forced legal and psychological systems to refine approaches to competency, criminal responsibility, and sentencing, providing broader lessons for future cases involving high-functioning offenders. Moreover, Kemper's story emphasized the importance of early intervention in psychological and behavioral disturbances. His history of familial trauma, maternal domination, and adolescent behavioral issues demonstrated how unresolved psychological challenges can escalate into severe criminality when combined with intelligence, social skills, and physical capability. While such escalation is not inevitable, Kemper's case illustrates the consequences of neglecting early signs of emotional and behavioral dysfunction. His life and crimes serve as both cautionary tale and study opportunity, emphasizing the necessity of intervention, observation, and support systems in mitigating potential threats. Public and scholarly fascination with Kemper also underscores the dual nature of his legacy. He is simultaneously a subject of horror and a case study in human behavior. His willingness to articulate motivations, describe compulsions, and reflect on personal history offers a depth of understanding that is rare among violent offenders. Scholars analyze his case to examine the cognitive and emotional mechanisms of pathology, while the public consumes narratives emphasizing both terror and insight. This duality is central to his enduring relevance. Kemper's story is not just about crimes committed, but about the mechanics, psychology, and societal implications of extreme behavior that lie in educational and professional contexts. His legacy informs criminology courses, forensic psychology programs, and law enforcement training. Detailed accounts of his victim selection, operational planning, and ritualized behaviors provide case studies that illuminate the cognitive patterns and psychological drivers of serial predation. By studying Kemper, professionals gain a practical understanding of the intersections between intellect, pathology, and compulsion, improving the capacity to identify, investigate, and prevent similar offenses in the future. Finally, Kemper's legacy prompts reflection on society's fascination with violence and criminal psychology. His story illustrates how intellect, pathology, and circumstance can converge to create behavior that is both horrifying and instructive. Through media coverage, academic study, and cultural representation, his case continues to resonate, providing a lens through which to examine human behavior, morality, and the mechanisms that can drive extreme acts. While his crimes remain a source of horror, the analytical study of his life, mind, and aftermath offers insight, understanding, and caution, ensuring that his legacy endures in both professional and cultural spheres.